The Byzantine Empire of Greece. Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction. So please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story in all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter. And if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 76: The Complex International Situation. Otto secretly promoted a marriage alliance between France and Spain to divert British attention, ideally through British intervention in the Spanish Civil War, allowing Greece to better expand its military in preparation for war against the Ottoman Empire. However, Queen Regent Christina of Spain, to prevent French support for Charles Carlos, drastically altered this course of events, potentially making Spain and France a unified nation. This was something the British absolutely did not want to see, and it triggered a dramatic shift in the European landscape. The British, completely absorbed by France and Spain, inadvertently gave Russia an opportunity to launch a full-scale attack on the Ottoman Empire. This was certainly not what Otto wanted. He could only regret his actions while simultaneously strengthening Greece and contacting the Polish Restoration Army, hoping to create some trouble for Russia. As for Austria, another major power, it was also caught in a dilemma. It did not want France and Spain to unite, nor did it want to see Russia possibly break free from the Vienna Convention. Suddenly, Europe was in turmoil, and diplomats from all countries were busy. In Kabul, the British envoy visited the King of Afghanistan. At this time, Afghanistan had just lost the important southern city of Peshawar to the Sikhimis, one of the Indian princely states. The Sikh Empire was a rare princely state in India with some spirit. The Sikhs had long been at odds with the British and were a major force in resisting British rule in India. However, the British now controlled most of India, and the tide had turned. Even if the Sikhs were unwilling, they had to temporarily bow to the British. The British visit to Afghanistan was primarily to win over the Afghans against Russia. Russia's territory in Central Asia was very close to Afghanistan. Beyond Afghanistan lay India. The British were extremely wary of anything that might threaten India, and the Afghans used this opportunity to ask the British for help in retaking Peshawar. Having finally pacified the Sikhs, the British were not yet prepared for war and thus rejected the Afghan demands. Subsequently, Afghanistan received Russian envoys. The Russians expressed their willingness to support Afghanistan in recapturing Peshawar, but some with ulterior motives spread rumors that Russia was preparing to attack India through Afghanistan. Upon hearing this rumor, the Viceroy of India immediately wrote home, requesting troops to seize Kabul before Russia could. As a result, Britain suffered its most devastating defeat since the Napoleonic Wars. The news of the British loss did not improve Otto's mood. Having learned his lesson, Otto put aside his regrets. Regardless of how the international situation changed, what needed to be done could not be delayed. After moving the capital to Athens, Otto's new task for the cabinet was to procure food supplies. Until last year, Europe had enjoyed several consecutive years of bumper harvests, causing food prices to plummet. However, Otto predicted that either this year or next, Europe would face food shortages. He had no memory of any food crisis in Europe in recent years. The only vivid memory he had was of the Irish famine. This prediction of future food shortages in Europe was, in fact, a projection based on reality. Food harvests cannot be plentiful every year, as the saying goes, extremes meet. Based on collected information, due to consecutive years of bumper harvests, many landowners have switched to cash crops, or even left their land fallow, as growing grain is simply unprofitable. This phenomenon is widespread in Europe, leading Otto to believe that man-made food shortages are likely to occur, at least next year, and food prices are likely to rise. For Greece, a country that cannot be self-sufficient in food, preparations must be made in advance. Last year, taking advantage of the bumper harvest, Greece seized the opportunity to purchase large quantities of grain, improving its grain reserve system. The Greek government's grain reserves are sufficient to feed 1 million people for a year. Having made this judgment, Otto decisively ordered the cabinet to double grain reserves, while also requiring agricultural companies to guarantee grain production. Even if the judgment was wrong, it wouldn't be a big deal. The grain reserves would be replaced annually, and the stale grain could be processed and sold at food processing plants without any loss. However, if the judgment was correct, Otto felt he might be facing a huge opportunity. After making these arrangements, Otto turned his attention to Egypt to the south. Since becoming king of Greece, Otto had never relaxed his focus on Egypt. Muhammad Ali was a rare talent, and such a man was equally ambitious. Seeing Egypt's continuous expansion and intensified military training, Otto knew he would never be content. During the Greek independence uprising, Muhammad Ali accepted an invitation from the Ottoman Empire to send troops to suppress the Greek rebellion in exchange for Syria and Crete. As a result, both the Egyptian navy and army suffered crushing defeats against the combined forces of Britain, France, and Russia. Muhammad I then used Egypt's defeat as a pretext to refuse the cession of Syria, agreeing only to cede Crete, which caused relations between Egypt and the Ottoman Empire to deteriorate rapidly. Enraged, Ali launched an invasion of the Ottoman Empire, only to be forced to withdraw due to Russian intervention and British and French mediation. In reality, having learned from his previous mistakes, Ali deeply regretted his earlier actions and realized that any further invasion of the Ottomans would inevitably face British intervention. Therefore, he resolved to reform the navy, purchasing advanced warships from France and training skilled workers, establishing his own shipyard. To date, the Egyptian Navy possesses 1 second-class warship, 15 third-class warships, and hundreds of various light gunboats, while 9 massive first-class warships are under construction. Meanwhile, to prevent the British from allying with other powers, he had worked for years to win over the French, and this time he even sent envoys to St. Petersburg with credentials, hoping to form an alliance with Russia to jointly oppose Britain. Of course, opposing Britain was not the ultimate goal. Ali also proposed to partition the Ottoman Empire with Russia. In return, Egypt was willing to cede territory formerly belonging to the Eastern Roman Empire and to submit to Russia. Nicholas I, upon receiving the credentials, was utterly disdainful. He looked down on Egypt, a place that wasn't even a truly independent nation, but he still agreed to sign a secret agreement with the Egyptians against the British. To Nicholas I, secret agreements were less valuable than toilet paper. It was commonplace for the powers to tear up agreements, and Russia was a prime example. Nicholas I wanted to see what gave the Egyptians the confidence to defy Britain. He hoped the British would suffer a loss, but even if Egypt lost, it wouldn't be a big deal for Russia. It could simply be ignored, and the British wouldn't do anything about such an agreement. Ali was overjoyed to receive Russia's response. He knew Nicholas I had his own plans, but the fact that Russia was willing to sign the secret agreement meant it wouldn't intervene until British interference failed. Not only was there good news from Russia, but France had also guaranteed that it would intervene if necessary should conflict break out between Britain and Egypt. As a shrewd politician, Ali knew that Nicholas I was unreliable and likely wanted to profit from the conflict between the two powers. However, the French assurances still held some credibility. France needed Egyptian cotton. Egypt had become France's second-largest cotton exporter after the United States, and the French textile industry was heavily reliant on Egypt. When Napoleon invaded Egypt, Ali had skillfully navigated the conflicts between the Ottoman Empire, the Mamluks, and Napoleon, playing both sides to ultimately seize power. The French might not directly send troops, but Ali believed that given the opportunity, they would certainly target the British. In this way, the three great powers of Britain, France, and Russia were broken up by his methods and would not unite to interfere in the war between Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. Chapter 77 The New Colony 1837 marked the final year of Greece's 5-year plan. During these 5 years, Greece's economy experienced tremendous growth, with all sectors flourishing, government revenue increasing significantly, and smiles appearing more frequently on the faces of the Greek people. At the Athens shipyard, Otto inspected the ships under construction specifically for transporting immigrants. Nearly 2 years had passed since Lyrismus's army arrived in the Congo region, and the Congo colony had been established. To date, the Congo colony had established 5 core colonial outposts, and thanks to Otto's relentless investment, the number of immigrants had reached 120,000. Compared to the current Angolan colony with only over 30,000 immigrants, Greece's colonial efficiency, honed by the substantial investment of the Royal Consortium, was perfectly demonstrated. To ensure efficient immigration, the Athens shipyard designed new, large immigrant ships, significantly increasing the number of immigrants each ship could carry. After several years of training, the Athens shipyard had a team of experienced shipbuilders, and the shipbuilding speed was not slow. Both the Congo colony and the large farms in California were severely lacking in manpower, and the emergence of these large immigrant ships was precisely to solve these problems. In fact, it wasn't just these two places. After the success of the Congo colony, Otto quickly set his sights on a new colonial target, the east coast of Africa, roughly corresponding to what would later become Tanzania. At this time, the coastal area of this region was ruled by the Abusa dynasty, established by the Omanis, and later generations mostly refer to it as the Sultanate of Oman, also known as the Sultanate of Zanzibar. Sanrin Port means harbor of peace, and Zhenghi, during his voyages to the Western Ocean, visited this coastal region. Because the Suez Canal was not yet open, it was a crucial stop for European ships traveling to Asia, and many merchant ships docked here for rest, contributing to its prosperity. The Sultanate of Oman encouraged Arabs to venture inland for slave hunting and ivory trading, and the region also cultivated local specialties such as cloves to sell to European merchants traveling through the area. Today, a large fleet has arrived at Sanrin Port, slowly entering the harbor under the guidance of a pilot. A force of over 3,000 heavily armed soldiers, along with a large number of immigrants, disembarked from the ship. This was the Greek colonial delegation sent by Otto. Leading the group was a guards colonel, Matonis. A veteran of the guards, and also a Greek, he had been recruited by Otto to his territory with his family during the Greek Wars of Independence, and later joined Otto's army as a member of the guards. He discovered the Greek immigrant caravan, especially those troops carrying advanced weaponry, which greatly alarmed the local governor. At this time, Sanrin was the most important core city of the Omani Sultanate in East Africa. Even years later, the Omani Sultanate would move its capital from Masreth to this location, and the governor here was a close confidant of the Sultan. The Omanis are native Arabs. As a former dominant power in the Indian Ocean, they had frequent dealings with European colonists. Zanzibar even clashed with a Portuguese colony of Mozambique over territorial disputes. Upon seeing the Greek colonial delegation, the local governor dared not act rashly and first sent someone to negotiate. Europeans of that era generally looked down on small countries like Zanzibar. People from other parts of Europe were considered barbarians and uncivilized. When Matonis arrived at the governor's palace with his guards, the governor had already prepared a banquet to welcome them, while subtly inquiring about the colonial delegation's intentions. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, the governor asked, "What brings you all here?" "Your Excellency," Matonis replied, "we intend to establish agricultural production in the inland region and will not threaten your country's rule in Zanzibar." Although Matonis believed his troops could easily seize the area, Otto insisted on maintaining friendly relations with Zanzibar until the colony was firmly established. Zanzibar wielded considerable power in the surrounding area, and while Matonis's regiment of guards could quickly capture Sanrin Port, it would inevitably draw them into war with the Omani Sultanate. War not only consumes vast amounts of resources and money, but also delays the progress of colonization. Even if victorious, a significant amount of time and effort is required for post-war recovery. Conversely, maintaining good relations with Zanzibar allows for the provision of essential food and other supplies to the colonies in the early stages, which is far more convenient than transporting them from Europe. From an economic perspective, maintaining good relations with Zanzibar in the early stages of colonization not only has no disadvantages, but also offers numerous benefits. The local governor, a man of some experience, didn't believe Matonis's words. He simply said, "The inland region is just a barren wasteland with nothing and no minerals. Colonizing there would likely be a losing proposition for your country." "Your Excellency, please rest assured," Matonis said patiently. "We're going there to develop farms and plantations, to grow food and some cash crops. Also, I heard you're capturing natives there to hunt ivory. Those natives threaten our farms, and we won't have much use for them. We can hand them over to you, and we can sell the ivory to you as well." "Really?" The governor of Sanrin Port was somewhat surprised, but still a little worried. "Rest assured, we can sign an agreement. This is just the first batch, more will follow. Confrontation will only bring disaster. Cooperation is the only way to achieve a win-win situation." Matonis's combination of pressure and persuasion set off alarm bells in the governor's mind. He tentatively inquired, "Then what about your country's troops?" "Please rest assured, Your Excellency, once we confirm the location, we will leave in 10 days at most. We won't stay here long," Matonis reassured him. "The main issue is that our subsequent supplies and personnel will need to transit through your ports. We hope you can provide convenience." The governor instantly understood Matonis's meaning. He had initially thought he would have to pay a hefty price, But the other party's request was unexpectedly simple. He immediately waved his hand generously. "Your Majesty, rest assured, we have always been willing to do our best to help our friends. We can designate a piece of land specifically for your country's use. However, your country cannot have any troops stationed within Zanzibar's territory, and your personnel at the port cannot carry weapons." Having reached this point, Matonis knew the deal was almost done, but he still bargained one last time. "That's no problem, but the safety of our personnel must be guaranteed. Therefore, we will leave 20 armed men to be responsible for the safety of those stationed at the port." 20 men wasn't a large number, not enough to threaten Zanzibar's rule, and the governor of Sanlin Port agreed after a brief consideration. After the agreement was reached, these colonial teams had a stable logistical support base, which was much better than when the colony of Congo was first established. During the initial development of the Congo colony, the governor of the Portuguese colony in Angola, in an effort to create trouble and delay its development, prohibited trade between the Angolan and Congo colonies. This resulted in even basic food supplies having to be imported from Europe in the early stages of the colony's establishment, and the costs of establishing the colony far exceeded the budget. Now, with trade through the Sultanate of Oman, the costs of colonization would be significantly reduced. Chapter 78: Entering the Industrial Age. Over the years, Otto funded expeditions not only for the Masaman family, and their successes weren't limited to the Congo region. It was only because Congo was closer to Europe by sea routes, and because he had some memories of the region from his previous life, knowing its abundant resources, that Otto chose the Congo colony as his first settlement. As other expeditions made their discoveries, more and more information about Central and Southern Africa came into Otto's hands, drawing his attention to this land in East Africa. Because his understanding of Africa in his previous life was limited, his impression of Central and Southern Africa was one of unbearable heat and vast tropical rainforests. But the data brought back by expeditions from East Africa broadened Otto's understanding. This new data showed him that although the inland regions of East Africa were located in the tropics, the plateau terrain made them more suitable for human habitation than the lower reaches of the Congo River. Temperatures ranged from 10 to 30 degrees Celsius year-round, with abundant rainfall during the rainy season, plentiful water resources, flat land, lush vegetation, and excellent natural conditions. Furthermore, the nearby port of Sanlin was a well-known port and, even today, a crucial maritime transportation hub. It could be said that the Sultanate of Oman was very adept at choosing its location. Of course, the Sultanate of Oman did possess considerable strength, at least it had made contact with European civilization and had some understanding of it, and its army was equipped with firearms. Otto did not choose military conquest from the outset, but instead planned to first establish a foothold in the inland regions, and then proceed with other matters once the colonies in East Africa had developed. Otto's plan included expansion goals for East Africa over the next 20 years. He even envisioned the Congo colony and East African colonies expanding into Central Africa, eventually forming a unified territory. Looking at the map, Otto's gaze lingered on the Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique, considering the possibility of annexing them in the future. Although the Portuguese had been operating there for centuries, the population remained sparse and development was extremely limited. Portugal itself was a small and declining country, its control over its colonies weakening daily. Otto was unwilling to see such prime territory wasted in Portuguese hands. With the establishment of colonies on the east and west coasts of Central and Southern Africa, sea routes from Greece to the Far Eastern empires began to take shape. Royal consortia transported industrial goods popular in the Far Eastern empires in exchange for large numbers of Chinese immigrants, along with some Far Eastern specialties. Besides the Royal consortia's ocean shipping companies, many Greek fleets also joined this route. On their return voyages, the royal fleets primarily transported immigrants, sending Chinese immigrants to East Africa and the Congo colony, and even back to mainland Greece. This meant that the royal consortia could barely break even operating this trade route, and might even incur losses. Other fleets, however, were more profit-driven, primarily engaging in commodity trade, incidentally transporting a small number of immigrants as a form of protection money paid to the escorting navy. Of course, because the Far Eastern Empire's market was not yet open, the overall trade volume was not very large, and it basically relied solely on smuggling. In the past 2 years, the annual number of Chinese immigrants received from the Far Eastern Empire was approximately 50,000 to 60,000, with some also being diverted to California and even mainland Greece and North America. After 2 years, when Britain launches its war against the Far Eastern Empire and the market opens, it is estimated that even more immigrants can be transported from the Far Eastern Empire. Of course, this will also lead to losses on ocean shipping routes, but as long as it can accelerate the development of the colonies, these investments will be worthwhile. Otto set a development investment period of 20 to 30 years for the colonies, from the initial investment until they could achieve a balance between income and expenditure. Once this period was over, truly good days would arrive. After reviewing the report from the East African colonies, Otto stretched. He needed to rest early that day. Tomorrow he would discuss matters with the cabinet and prepare for the arrival of an important guest next month. Alexander Nikolaevich, the Russian crown prince from St. Petersburg and Otto's future brother-in-law, officially began his European study tour, with Athens being one of his stops. Thinking of his future brother-in-law, Otto also thought of Queen Victoria, who was about to ascend the throne. Historically, the two seem to have been lovers, only to be separated for political reasons. For the British, this was the golden age of the British Empire. The empire on which the sun never sets was nearing its full formation, and Britain was about to reach its zenith. Britain had completed the Industrial Revolution ahead of other European countries, and its GDP far exceeded that of other major powers, making it a veritable factory of the world. In the eyes of modern Europeans, the British Navy was invincible at this time. Even if all the navies of Europe were combined, the British would have a way to sink them all. Future Britons will also recall a statement that Otto remembered vividly and envied greatly in his past life. The plains of North America and Russia are cornfields, Chicago and Odessa are our granaries, Canada and the Baltic are our forests, Australia and West Asia are our sheep fields, Argentina and the western grasslands of North America are our cattle fields, Peru brings its silver, South Africa and Australia's gold flows to London, Indians and Qing Chinese grow tea for us, and our coffee, sugar cane, and spice plantations are spread across the Indian archipelago. Spain and France are our vineyards, the Mediterranean is our orchard, and our cotton fields, which have long grown in the southern United States, are expanding to all the warmer regions of the earth. This era is one that many Britons will fondly remember. The upper-class nobles and merchants indulged in lavish lifestyles, gathering with friends and dozens of hunting dogs for hunts. The middle class could own a house in the city, marry a wife, hire a maid, have several children, and send them to school, living a comfortable and respectable life. But for the British lower class, it was far from idyllic. They worked 18 hours a day, and a single misstep could lead to being caught in machinery. Even if they survived, they were often sent to poorhouses to die. The toxic fumes and wastewater from factories and cities constantly ravaged people's health, and doctors of the time typically only knew how to treat it with bloodletting. If bloodletting didn't work, they would even cut off parts of your body until you couldn't afford the treatment or died. Even 6 or 7-year-old children, driven by the necessities of life, had to go down into the coal mines every day, doing heavy manual labor for 12 hours in cramped, filthy spaces for a meager wage. This was perhaps a necessary stage of industrialization, the price the British paid for development, though many in the British upper class didn't seem to care. Greece was in a similar period. Although Otto, influenced by his previous life, strongly advocated for and enacted strict labor protection laws, the lives of workers remained extremely difficult. Their life paths were already set, they could only work a grueling 12-hour day, selling their labor for a meager living, and many didn't live past their 40s. They pinned their hopes on their children, hoping they would achieve excellent grades, win scholarships, acquire knowledge, and find more respectable and easier jobs after graduation. But this was destined to be achieved by only a small percentage of children. The majority would repeat their parents' lives. Because of labor protection laws, many capitalists, in order to reduce costs, have targeted foreign workers for exploitation. Greek government officials have not been as proactive in handling labor disputes involving foreign workers as they have been in supporting native Greeks. Even though Otto himself repeatedly emphasized this, and even addressed some issues during his inspections, briefing all government officials, and publicizing the issues in newspapers, such situations remain prevalent in many areas beyond his reach. Chapter 79. Inside the train car. Greece is taking Alexander's visit very seriously. Maintaining good diplomatic relations with Britain and Russia is a top diplomatic priority for Greece, and thorough preparation is essential. As a small country, Greece dares not offend Russia. Normally, even when the Russian crown prince travels for study tours, he doesn't stay in a small country for too long. However, According to arrangements from Russia, Alexander will stay in Greece for a full month, which Otto has to take seriously. The reason the future Alexander II will stay in Greece for so long is simply to improve Russo-Greek relations and strengthen cooperation between the two sides. Although Britain's attention is being diverted by the French, it has resolutely responded to Russia's several covert probing attacks. This meant that even though things were serious in France, Britain was still keeping a close eye on Russia, and Otto was hesitant about whether to take a step towards aligning with Russia now. Despite some unexpected changes in the international situation, since the British still had the energy to monitor the Near East, Otto felt slightly relieved, but also became more cautious about his next choices. To this end, Otto prematurely ended his inspection of the border railway, requisitioned a train, temporarily using it as his royal carriage, and returned to Athens. Sitting on the bumpy train, Otto leisurely sipped his tea, gazing out the window at the neat, level fields of Thessalia he passed, a look of satisfaction on his face. It's August now, and the crops in the fields are nearing harvest. The neat wheat fields ripple like waves in the gentle breeze. And in the distance, on the hillsides, vineyards hang laden with plump grapes, a vibrant sight. Natasha walked over softly, seemingly sensing Otto's good mood, and smiled, saying, "It seems the officials dealt with this time haven't affected your mood. If I were to be angry every time because of official corruption, I'm afraid I, the king, wouldn't have a good mood every day." Even in the internet age, with its incredibly sophisticated surveillance methods, corruption still persists. How much more so in this era? The official Otto just punished wasn't only guilty of corruption, more importantly, he had excessively exploited the foreign laborers building the railway in order to expedite its completion and claim credit, leading to far more deaths and injuries than permitted. Corruption wasn't considered a particularly serious crime in that era. It was difficult to find officials who weren't corrupt. The key issue is that these corrupt officials also failed to perform their duties properly. Essentially, every time Otto made an inspection tour, he would punish some officials, primarily for corruption. In reality, he was using those greedy, incompetent, and incompetent fools as examples to scare the rest. Under normal circumstances, if one can carefully restrain their greed and efficiently complete the tasks assigned by the government, they are still within the observation range and will not be punished for the time being. They might even be promoted if they perform well. Speaking of which, Alexander's stay in Greece this time is so long, and he brought so many people with him. It seems he wants to figure out Greece's situation, Otto couldn't help but say. Natasha smiled and said, "It's said that when the crown prince came to Greece, besides you, the first person on the list of those visiting was Bishop Eugene." As someone who had always been by Otto's side, Natasha knew Otto's superficial friendliness towards Russia, yet his deep-seated fear of it. Even after becoming Nicholas I's prospective son-in-law, Otto had never forgotten his wariness of Russia. Of course, the British received the same treatment, and Otto was even more wary of the British than the Russians. After Otto became king, Greece established an independent Orthodox diocese, and Archbishop Eugene became the Orthodox Archbishop of Greece. Following his previous conversation with Otto, Archbishop Eugene did not discuss an alliance with Russia again, but as both countries were predominantly Orthodox, he naturally felt favorable feelings towards Russia. The Russians were probably aware of this, which is why, upon arriving in Greece, Alexander the Great's first visit was to Archbishop Eugene. Upon hearing this news, Otto couldn't help but frown, but quickly regained his composure and said, "I know that Bishop Eugene and the Russian Archbishop have been corresponding." In his letters, he praised the achievements of Greek construction to the skies. Alexander will most likely be visiting many of these achievements during his visit. Natasha smiled knowingly at Otto, her expressive eyes seeming to say, "There are no outsiders here, so you don't need to say such polite things." Otto knew that Natasha usually showed him no respect. After confirming that no one else was around, he reached out and pulled her into his arms, his hands beginning to wander, his predatory gaze almost devouring her. This startled Natasha, who was rather conservative by nature. Although she had become Otto's lover, she still couldn't accept such an activity in broad daylight. She quickly refused, saying, "Your Majesty, it's still broad daylight, and Alice and the others are still waiting outside the carriage. Am I that scary? I won't eat people." Otto had a smug smile on his face. He had only meant to joke, but he stopped what he was doing and said, "We'll probably return to Athens around dusk. Tell Corinth that once we arrive in Athens, immediately summon Prime Minister Sanos and the cabinet members to see me. I'm going to hold a cabinet meeting." As soon as he finished speaking, Natasha immediately stood up, straightening the wrinkles in her clothes as she walked out. Watching her flee the carriage in disarray, Otto fell into deep thought. Greece wasn't a large country, and Otto, having departed from the border in the morning, had returned to Athens by evening, thanks to the slow pace of the trains in that era. Although the long, swaying train journey had left him exhausted, Otto still convened a cabinet meeting at the palace. The main topic of this meeting was the policies and strategic goals Greece would adopt after completing its 5-year plan this year. This would also influence Otto's attitude towards Alexander's visit. The cabinet members weren't already familiar with the content of the meeting. Originally, the meeting was scheduled to begin in 5 days, but Alexander's visit forced Otto to return to Athens early, necessitating an earlier start. After dinner that evening, Otto arrived at the palace council chamber, where all the cabinet members were already present. "Greetings, Your Majesty." Upon seeing Otto enter the chamber, the cabinet members bowed in greeting. "I'm so sorry to have called you all here so late," Otto said. "This is the final year of our 5-year plan, and most of the goals we set have been achieved, with many projects even exceeding expectations, such as the railway and agricultural plans. Many of us thought the plan was impossible when it was first formulated, and I thank you all for your efforts for Greece to achieve these results. It's all for Your Majesty. It's all thanks to Your Majesty's foresight." The cabinet ministers quickly chimed in, saying that it was only right. When the 5-year plan began, they hadn't expected such great success either, but the current achievements filled them with pride. After all, looking at all the European countries now, no country can compare with Greece's economic growth rate over the past 5 years. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, Otto got down to business. "We must celebrate our past successes, but we must also recognize the complex situation and dangers that Greece faces going forward. The situation in Europe has changed rapidly in the past year. The British and French are locked in a fierce struggle because of the Spanish Civil War, while Egypt and the Ottoman Empire are both preparing for war. Russia and Austria are eyeing the Ottoman Empire, especially the Balkans. We, Greece, located at the southernmost tip of the Balkans, are naturally at the center of this turmoil. How to deal with this complex international situation is an urgent matter that we, Greece, must consider." Chapter 80 Alexander's Visit. "Your Majesty, I think we should appropriately strengthen our relationship with Russia. The British are currently preoccupied and unable to guarantee stability in the Balkans. At this time, we need to rely on Russia to ensure Greece's security and interests." Archbishop Eugene spoke first. He was consistently a member of the pro-Russian faction, so his words were not surprising. However, because of previous conversations, he hadn't directly proposed an alliance with Russia. "Your Majesty, I think this requires careful consideration, and we need to see what conditions Russia can offer." Prime Minister Sanos, a neutral figure, had always felt that whether Greece aligned itself with Britain or Russia depended on what benefits the other side could offer. The finance minister stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, I believe we should not intervene in the conflicts between the great powers for the time being. Our economy is developing rapidly, and fiscal revenue is increasing, but our debt is also substantial. I think the most important thing is for us to quickly formulate a new 5-year plan to take Greece's development to the next level." The interior minister replied, "However, Your Majesty, the situation in the Balkans is not optimistic. It is foreseeable that Egypt and the Ottoman Empire will go to war, and Russia is very likely to take advantage of the situation. Given Greece's current location, it is difficult for us to remain uninvolved. Furthermore, I believe Russia has always harbored ambitions to annex the Balkan Peninsula. If Russia truly defeats the Ottoman Empire, it's hard to guarantee that Russia won't turn its attention to us. Therefore, I think we should maintain relations with the British to ensure Greece's safety. There shouldn't be too much to worry about," said the Minister of Transport. "Don't forget, His Majesty is engaged to Princess Alexandra and will soon become the Tsar's son-in-law. If Russia attacks the Ottoman Empire, we can also send troops, and perhaps even seize some territory from the Ottomans. A marriage alliance alone can't stop the Tsar's ambitions," the Minister of the Interior sneered. "Russia's greed for land is insatiable. Faced with a Russian empire, Greece has little power to resist. Would a lion consider a deer a true ally?" Soon, the cabinet ministers began to argue. Generally, they were divided into two factions. One advocated maintaining friendly relations with Britain and preventing Russia from entering the Balkans, as this would threaten Greece's security. The other faction believed in an alliance with Russia to participate in the partition of the Ottoman Empire and expand Greek territory. The two sides debated back and forth for a while, unable to reach a consensus. Finally, everyone turned to Otto, hoping he would make the decision. Sure enough, being an official for so long makes you all a seasoned veteran, Otto thought to himself, observing the cabinet ministers. The situation is still unclear, and most cabinet members are unable to determine what to choose. Even if they have some inclination, they are not very firm in their decision. At this point, the argument seems somewhat staged, and ultimately, the decision will have to be left to Otto. After a moment's thought, Otto said, "The crux of the debate is whether Russia harbors any intention to annex us, and the weighing of pros and cons if we choose to align ourselves with the Russians. Alexander II's recent visit is undoubtedly on Nicholas I's behalf. We can use him to probe Russia's intentions and see what they're really planning. If we can gain tangible benefits, we can also align ourselves with Russia. The Russians are relatively crude in their diplomacy, but correspondingly, they don't have as many underhanded tactics as the British. The Tsar's attitude largely represents Russia's attitude. As for our own country, I believe that whatever choice we make, for now, we should focus on economic development. A new 5-year plan needs to be formulated quickly, summarizing past experiences and further enhancing Greece's national strength based on its current situation. The stronger Greece is, the more freedom of choice it will have in the international arena in the future. The final outcome of the cabinet meeting still depends on Russia's situation, which is Greece's predicament. Greece is still too weak. A slight mistake could bury the achievements of the past years. Faced with choices that determine the fate of the nation, caught between several major powers, it has very little room for its own choice. Alexander, arriving at the port of Athens, was in high spirits. As the crown prince of one of the world's most powerful empires, he had been met with all sorts of flattery and praise since his arrival. When the ship arrived at the port, Alexander disembarked with his entourage. He saw that the person in charge of welcoming him was Archbishop Eugene. Upon seeing him, Alexander took the initiative to greet him, saying, "I didn't expect it to be you, Archbishop Eugene, who came to greet me. I haven't had a chance to congratulate Athens on its successful reconstruction. I'm so sorry. Your Highness is too kind. Compared to the mighty Russian Empire, our achievements are insignificant." Alexander smiled and said, "You're being too modest. At least for now, there's only one experimental railway within the empire's borders. Greece has already extended its railway from Athens to the border. My father has always been passionate about the railway project. He's determined to build the railway from St. Petersburg to Moscow, and has even established a railway bureau and a temporary technical committee, appointing me as its chairman. I remember when Otto visited St. Petersburg last time, he was very knowledgeable about the railway. This time in Greece, I'll definitely take a good look at your newly built railway. Your Highness can certainly talk more with His Majesty Otto about the railway. His Majesty has also put in a great deal of effort to build it." Alexander arrived at the Athens royal palace, where a grand ceremony was held. All the officials of Greece were present, and Otto led the way in welcoming Alexander. Otto didn't necessarily need to come to greet them personally, but at that time, he was practically the only heir in the Greek royal family, so he had no choice but to make the gesture. After a series of elaborate formalities, Otto, as the host, smiled and said, "Alexander, welcome to Athens." Otto and Alexander were old acquaintances. They had met several times during Otto's visit to St. Petersburg. In Europe, people of similar status usually interact directly, without much beating around the bush. They were all young, chatting and go hunting in the countryside with the young nobles of St. Petersburg, which felt a bit like a reunion of college classmates from a previous life. Alexander laughed and said, "Thank you, Otto. It's been almost 2 years since we last met. You don't seem to have changed much. Really? You do look quite mature. Now that you're in Greece, why don't I, as your host, arrange your itinerary? What would you like to see? I can show you around." "Of course, no problem." Alexander's eyes flickered, and he quickly agreed, "I've always heard that you've governed Greece very well since becoming king. It'll be a good opportunity for me to see it for myself. Perhaps when I become czar, I can learn some experience from you. That might be difficult for me. You know, Greece is just a small country in the Mediterranean. Governing a small country is easy, but ruling a vast empire is much more difficult and complex. My experience probably won't be that useful to you." "Haha, what you say makes sense, But I'm here on a mission. My father told me to learn more from you, so you can't hold back. Since my father-in-law has spoken, I naturally won't refuse. After all, we're all family." Otto smiled and agreed. Chapter 81 Economic Control? Upon arriving in Athens, Alexander seemed quite interested and wanted to explore the area the very next day. Led by Otto, he visited the University of Athens, a nearby shipyard, and even made a special trip to the Piraeus Industrial District, which had recently flourished. Finally, at Alexander's request, Otto accompanied him on a train journey, traveling a large loop through various parts of Greece. On the surface, Alexander appeared to be simply sightseeing, enjoying the local scenery and discussing Greek customs that were new to him. However, in reality, Alexander's entourage was observing Greece very closely, clearly wanting to use this opportunity to get a feel for the country. While Alexander appeared to be sightseeing, he was actually mostly observing Greece's strength before deciding on his approach. Otto was naturally aware of this and wasn't entirely unprepared. He openly shared relatively public information, but kept crucial details hidden. These included research and design of new weapons in the military factories, warships under construction in the shipyards, and new technologies and production volumes at the steel mills. Through this period of interaction, Otto also gained a general understanding of Russia's strategy. Nicholas I had clearly decided to once again participate in the struggle for interests in the Near East. Of course, while Otto subtly probed Alexander's intentions, Alexander also reaped his own rewards. This trip was quite long, ostensibly a study tour across Europe to broaden his horizons, but in reality, it also served to observe the situations in various countries. Normally, a small country like Greece wouldn't be a significant target, but Nicholas I specifically sent him there and arranged for his entourage to operate discreetly. Nicholas I didn't go into too much detail, but Alexander knew what he had to do. After touring Greece extensively, he finally expressed that since Otto had seen the Tsar's guard in St. Petersburg, he wanted to see Otto's guard as well. "No problem," Otto said with a smile. "The Greek army is relatively new and doesn't have the glorious achievements of the Tsar's Janissaries, but I've still put a lot of effort into it." For this exercise, Otto only concealed some new weapons. He didn't hide anything about the routine tactical training. As a result, Alexander was quite pleased with the Greek Janissaries' training, and unusually, he asked Otto many questions and offered his opinions. Due to the influence of Napoleon's tactical thinking, European tactics were now centered on offense, and this thinking continued until World War I. However, the Greek Janissaries, because Otto understood military shifts, placed greater emphasis on mobility and defensive warfare. They maneuvered the enemy at high speed, launched swift raids at opportune moments, established defensive lines at key military locations, forced the enemy to attack, dug trenches, utilized pre-prepared positions, depleted the enemy's numbers and morale, and then sought opportunities to counterattack and annihilate them. This was considered unorthodox in the current European armies that prioritized offensive operations, which ironically aligned with Alexander's ideas. Russian Tsars had a tradition of studying military knowledge and gaining experience in the military, and coupled with Nicholas I's enthusiasm for the military, Alexander received rigorous training in this area. Perhaps due to youthful rebellion, his military inclinations often contradicted those of Nicholas I. If you favored offense, I'd prioritize defense. If you prefer direct confrontation, I'd choose flanking maneuvers. As a result, Alexander suffered many beatings from Nicholas I from a young age. Furthermore, other Russian generals disagreed with his military ideas, leaving him feeling isolated and alone. Unexpectedly, he encountered like-minded companions in Greece, which immediately excited Alexander, who had only requested to observe military exercises to complete his mission. He and Otto chatted about various topics. "Vladimir, do you think we can achieve our goal in coming to Greece?" Alexander asked his aide-de-camp after observing the military exercises. Vladimir calmly replied, "Your Highness, it's actually quite easy to win over the arrogant Greeks, but King Otto of Greece is a bit difficult to deal with." Alexander didn't respond, gesturing for him to continue. Due to historical reasons, many Greeks have always harbored unrealistic fantasies of restoring the glory of the Byzantine Empire. However, King Otto has consistently suppressed this ideology behind the scenes, preventing the widespread dissemination of Pan-Hellenicism through newspapers and other media. Our personnel in Greece have conducted investigations, and even so, the vast majority of Greeks identify with Pan-Hellenicism. They believe Greece should reclaim those areas inhabited by large Greek populations and still under Ottoman rule, and even restore Greece to its former territory during the Byzantine Empire's rule. Restore the territory during the Eastern Roman Empire's rule? What an unrealistic fantasy. Alexander said dismissively. At its peak, the Byzantine Empire encompassed the entire Balkans and Apennine Peninsula, Asia Minor, Western Arabia, North Africa, and even parts of southern Spain. Greece, a small country destined to be subservient to larger powers, was still clinging to such ideas. Anyone who heard this would find it incredibly arrogant. No wonder Alexander wore a disdainful expression. This is nothing but the wishful thinking of ignorant fools. King Otto of Greece is a very rational man, but I think he also has the idea of expanding his territory. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made demands for the Thessalonians at the London Peace Conference. Later, he even negotiated with the British and reclaimed the Ionian Islands. These were all territories he expanded without bloodshed by taking advantage of the situation. I must say, he is really smart enough. As long as Otto has the idea of expanding in the Balkans, he has the opportunity to be used by us, Alexander said. You're right. Although the British are preoccupied with France, they remain relentless in their attempts to probe the Near East, as His Majesty Nicholas has recently made. Under these circumstances, His Majesty's idea is to use the Egyptians and Greeks to destabilize the Near East and create opportunities for the Russian Empire. However, getting Otto to betray the British and launch an attack on the Ottoman Empire against their will likely come at a high price. It's just a few promises, Alexander said nonchalantly. Even contracts can be torn up at will. I believe Otto knows that taking what he can't control will only bring disaster. After all, Greece is just a small country, at most the Netherlands. Your Highness is right. Greece has developed rapidly in recent years, much like Belgium. Now Greece is the empire's largest trading partner in the Balkans, and a natural ally in the Balkans, Vladimir said meaningfully. You mean to control Greece economically? Alexander asked, slightly surprised. Greece is resource poor, unable even to be self-sufficient in food. Geographically speaking, importing various minerals and grains from Russia is the most cost-effective option, Vladimir said with a smile. As far as I know, Greece imports a large amount of minerals and grains from the empire every year. The faster they develop, the more dependent they become on the empire. That's right. Greece's land is extremely barren, and the resources needed for national development cannot be provided domestically. They must import them. While there are indeed many countries in the world that can provide resources, considering the cost of transportation, Greece's best choice is to import from Ukraine. In fact, the Greeks did just that. Although King Otto saw the danger and appropriately imported some grain and minerals from Austria, Britain, and the German regions, nearly half of their grain and minerals still came from our country. Austria is also currently building railways and new steel mills, and the amount of minerals they can supply to Greece is insufficient. The British, however, won't do business at a loss. They don't offer any discounts to Greece. In this regard, Greece's best option is our Russian Empire. There is no other choice. After a moment's thought, Alexander nodded. Your idea is excellent. We can use the economy to control Greece and gradually bring it closer to us. Your Highness, you misunderstand. This isn't actually my idea, but rather a suggestion from the Minister of Finance to His Majesty Nicholas. He astutely observed the changes in trade between Greece and the Empire in recent years. Ha ha ha. In any case, it is indeed a good method. Alexander laughed loudly. And most importantly, what do you think of the Greek army? Are they capable of dealing with the Ottoman army? If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 82 Marine Corps? The Greek army is well trained and well equipped, but they lack combat experience due to their inexperience in major battles. However, they should be able to handle the corrupt Ottoman Empire's army. The key issue is their insufficient numbers. They only number a little over 30,000. If the Ottomans choose to use human wave tactics, the Greeks will likely face a tough fight. After all, Greece's population is only a little over 1 million, so 30,000 is not a small number, Alexander said. Moreover, if we don't make the Greeks suffer a bit, how will they know that the only way to defeat the Ottomans is to side with the empire? The trip to Greece yielded satisfactory results. Alexander did not immediately propose an alliance with Greece, knowing that Otto, with his shrewdness, would not easily choose sides. He only proposed strengthening economic ties and expanding bilateral trade. Russia needed to take time to gradually control Greece, instigate a war between Greece and the Ottoman Empire, and destabilize the Near East. For centuries, Russia had considered the Ottoman Empire its primary war target. Almost every czar had launched the Russo-Turkish War. One could even say that a czar who didn't fight the Ottomans was not a competent czar. Before launching another Russo-Turkish War, Russia could also use Egypt and Greece to weaken the Ottoman Empire, while simultaneously buying time to prepare for war and raise military funds. Military expenditure has always been a problem plaguing successive tsars. Russia doesn't lack soldiers, but its finances are almost always in deficit. Especially since Nicholas I recently decided to invest heavily in the construction of a railway from St. Petersburg to Moscow, the construction of which consumes a large amount of funds, making it even more difficult for Russia to raise military funds. Therefore, Russia needs time to prepare and is not in a hurry to act. Otto didn't understand why Alexander hadn't directly proposed an alliance this time. It didn't quite fit his impression of Alexander, but he was happy with it, since it wasn't the right time for Greece to take a stand. As for strengthening economic cooperation, he agreed without much hesitation, leaving the specifics to his subordinates for negotiation. People of Otto and Alexander's stature wouldn't easily participate in the details. Alexander stayed in Greece for 43 days, finally leaving with a warm welcome from the Greeks to continue his studies in other parts of Europe. Lyris, I have an idea. Perhaps the Navy could form a Marine Corps, Otto said shortly after his departure, summoning Rear Admiral Lyris to the palace to discuss the matter. The Marine Corps? We have existing army troops, we can just send them there by ship. Sending our navy to fight on land seems a bit like neglecting our duties. I think it's very necessary. The navy and army have their respective roles, which is good in war, but when troops need to conduct amphibious landing operations, a problem arises. That is, after the order is issued, we can't find the most suitable troops to complete the mission because the army doesn't consider whether soldiers can swim or row. Do you expect them to learn on the battlefield? Does this mean the enemy's coastal defenses will watch our soldiers slowly learn to swim and row before they start loading their shells? Actually, Marines weren't a new concept in this era. Britain, France, and the United States all had them, though they called them naval infantry. Apart from these three countries, other nations, as Lewis described, simply loaded their troops onto ships and sent them ashore. But Otto believed that amphibious warfare capabilities were crucial for Greece, situated in the Mediterranean, and that establishing a Marine Corps was a major future trend. The Marine Corps missions extend beyond beach landings. They can also be responsible for reconnaissance, clearing obstacles for ships or landing forces, infiltrating from the sea, and launching surprise attacks and demolitions against enemy coastal defenses or even ports. Some of these missions present problems that the Navy might encounter in combat, and coordinating with the Army only during wartime would obviously miss opportunities. Furthermore, temporarily deployed Army personnel are unlikely to demonstrate professional competence. For example, in nighttime landings and surprise attacks, soldiers would quietly approach the shore in small boats under the cover of darkness, then jump into the waves and wade ashore from a distance of about 100 meters. If some soldiers are unfamiliar with swimming and haven't received professional training, and after everyone has finally landed, a patrol of enemy troops happens to be passing by. While everyone is carefully hiding, holding their breath to avoid being detected, a soldier experiencing discomfort might suddenly vomit, potentially causing the entire operation to fail. Therefore, establishing a professional Marine Corps is crucial. After Otto briefly explained the situation, Lewis expressed his support. The Marine Corps being subordinate to the Navy not only facilitates naval tactical deployments but also allows it to compete with the Army for combat missions when necessary. The rivalry between the Navy and the Army exists in every country, since military spending is limited. When competing for military budget allocations, both the Navy and the Army emphasize their own role in order to secure more funding. So, what are your thoughts on how to build the Marine Corps? Otto asked. As Your Majesty previously stated, the Marine Corps should not be limited to amphibious operations, it can also be responsible for reconnaissance, sabotage, infiltration, landing, and counter-landing missions. This is a completely new branch of service, and no country has attempted this before. We can only learn through trial and error after the unit is established. However, it is certain that the Marine Corps has very high requirements for individual soldiers, so we must select the best of the best. We can recruit from fishermen and sailors within the country. After all, they are already proficient swimmers, more familiar with the sea, and physically strong enough. Recruiting these people can at least avoid having to teach soldiers how to swim from scratch. Very good, it seems you already have some ideas. Also, these are some preliminary training programs that I've discussed with some experts, but they haven't been tested in practice yet. You can try them out and see if they work. You can add or delete as needed. We'll have to wait for the actual testing and then summarize the experience to refine them. We're all feeling our way across the river. Try any ideas you have, and then summarize the experience through exercises to identify problems. Hopefully, when real combat is needed, the Marine Corps can play its due role. Otto gestured, and a servant quickly handed an envelope to Lieutenant General Riris. Otto didn't know how to train the Marines either. What he taught Lieutenant General Ryusui were things he'd seen in military dramas in his past life, which were bound to be unrealistic. These are some training subjects I've envisioned. There are bound to be parts that don't fit reality, and they're not comprehensive. You'll need to use your abilities to improve them. Thank you, Your Majesty. Ryusui took the envelope, put it in his arms, and then asked, "So, how much military funding does Your Majesty intend to allocate?" Haha, I knew you'd bring this up. Let's tentatively set the Marine Corps at 1 regiment. Calculate the specific funding needed and give me a report. I'll arrange for someone to review it. Chapter 83 North American Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The smoke of battle had barely cleared from the newly recaptured Mexico City when Tassinana was already preparing to continue the pursuit of the rebels. Having dealt a heavy blow to the rebels' main force in Mexico City, he intended to further destroy General José's power, thereby consolidating the territory controlled by the Mexican government. Tassinana remained vigilant, stationing trusted confidants in Mexico City and bringing with him surplus weapons and equipment. After all, besides General José, there were other factions in Mexico. Mexico had many local forces, not just General José's rebellion in the south. Although the Spanish had been driven out, the royalist forces in Mexico remained substantial and opposed Tassinana's republican stance. If they too were instigated by the Americans to rebel, the Mexican Civil War would continue indefinitely. Tassinana had previously discovered that as every military deployment was detected in advance. This strange situation made him acutely aware that there was a traitor within his ranks. After an investigation, he found that there were more than just 1 or 2 traitors among him, and their backgrounds were quite complex. He couldn't immediately ascertain how many forces had planted spies within his ranks. However, according to the confessions of José's rebel spies, the rebels had American support, and much of the government's intelligence was provided to them by the Americans. Moreover, José's forces were not the only ones connected to the Americans. Unable to determine whether there were other, more deeply hidden traitors, he decided to lead his army in a direct assault on the rebels' most important stronghold, Cerrado, and then seize Mexico City. These southern rebels were inherently weaker than Tassinana's army, and their ranks were also riddled with internal factions. Seeing the dire situation, General José's collaborators chose to surrender or retreat south. Left with no other option, José led his remaining troops to his southern stronghold, intending to wage guerrilla warfare against Tassinana using the vast southern plains. However, in order to quickly quell the rebellion, Tassinana took drastic measures, ordering his troops to plunder the homes of rebel families and hunt down rebels throughout the South. Even considering the lessons learned in Texas, and in order to completely destroy the morale of the rebels, Tassinana directly ordered his soldiers to loot food. Those who didn't want to starve had to obey his orders to clear land in the north. At this time, northern Mexico was sparsely populated, almost uninhabited. Excluding Texas, which had already been sold to France, California and New Mexico, the 2 largest states, had a combined population of less than 100,000. To avoid a repeat of the Texas incident, Tassinana was quite ruthless. Of course, Mexico paid a huge price for this, with its domestic production and economy severely damaged. In his efforts to thoroughly eliminate local forces in the south, Tassinana caused nearly 500,000 deaths and displaced hundreds of thousands, while Mexico's population at the time was only 7 million. Although this effectively eliminated many local forces in southern Mexico and strengthened the government's control, it also significantly weakened Mexico's overall strength. The 50 million francs paid by the French after the rebellion was quelled were far from enough to compensate for the losses incurred by the Civil War. Desperate, General José was forced to flee Mexico, hoping to rise again in France, but he was ultimately captured and secretly executed by Tassinana. In contrast to the devastation of post-war Mexico, Texas, under French control, thrived. With the tacit approval of the new governor of Texas, the slave trade was reinstated. Not only did Brooke become a prominent middleman, but Portuguese slave traders also saw the opportunity and transported ship after ship of slaves to the Gulf of Mexico. Plantations sprang up across Texas, and French nobles and merchants who invested enjoyed the life of large plantation owners. In his first year in office, the governor of Texas shipped 30 ships of wheat, cotton, and other goods back to the country and paid 5 million francs in taxes. This fueled the French interest in further expanding their colonies in North America. Like the Americans, they set their sights on the weaker Mexico. Both Americans and French began infiltrating northern Mexico, employing methods similar to those used by the Americans in Texas. This was a key reason why Tassinana forced large-scale Mexican migration to the north. Failure to do so would mean handing California and New Mexico over to the U.S. and France, something Tassinana could not accept. He completely ignored the U.S. government's offer to buy California and New Mexico from Mexico. But Otto knew that even with immigration, it would be virtually impossible for Mexico to hold on to these two large states on its own. The Mexican government lacks the funds to support large-scale immigration, its population is far smaller than that of the United States, and its military combat effectiveness is lacking. At best, it can only delay the loss of these two territories. Otto's prospecting teams have already discovered gold mines in California and are preparing to deploy manpower for mining, even recruiting a group of displaced Mexicans to farm on nearby farms. He hopes Mexico can hold out for as long as possible, as this will buy Otto more time to mine more gold and simultaneously create trouble for the Americans. The longer Mexico holds out, the more time Otto has to develop and expand his large farms in California, giving him more confidence to protect his interests in the region and delay the exposure of the California gold mines as much as possible. As for completely preventing the Americans from occupying California and instead securing this valuable territory on the American West Coast, the chances of success were slim. Besides the success of their own development in California, the success depended heavily on how long the French and Mexicans could hold out. Greece was too far from the western part of North America, and the Panama Canal wasn't open yet. Traveling from Greece to California required circumnavigating the entire continent of South America. The support Greece could provide to prevent the American annexation of California was extremely limited, and the royal family's financial groups needed a large population and ample time to develop there. It's understandable that the Americans were eyeing Mexico. It was a tempting prize right in front of them, and they felt obligated to take it. Although Mexico possesses the world's largest silver mines, corruption and bribery result in meager government revenue, often forcing the government to rely on debt to survive. Furthermore, Mexico is plagued by numerous factions, frequently embroiled in bloody and brutal conflicts over the ownership of these silver mines, almost resembling small-scale wars. It's as if Mexico is constantly embroiled in civil war, a type of conflict that severely depletes a nation's resources. In this instance, Tassinana quelled the rebellion, and through arms sales, the royal consortium acquired several silver mines in Mexico. Considering they lacked the resources to contend with the complex power dynamics within Mexico, the royal consortium sold these silver mines to the French, investing the proceeds in the development of the west coast of North America. Compared to the value of these mines, it was a bargain sale. The French eagerly took over the mines, feeling the royal consortium had been completely taken advantage of and they had made a huge profit. However, Otto believed that investing elsewhere and developing the colonies more quickly would yield far greater future benefits than the lackluster silver mines. After the Mexican Civil War ended, Tassinana demanded that the French pay the remaining balance from the purchase of Texas. Considering that it was not yet the right time to break with the Mexicans, the French, after some discussion, decided to pay the final 50 million francs. With this money in hand, Mexico, through the royal consortium, ordered a large quantity of arms, even though Mexico was in internal turmoil and desperately needed to recover. Unfortunately, both the Americans and the French were now eyeing Mexico's northern territories. If Mexico couldn't maintain its military strength, it risked losing New Mexico and California in the near future, and might even become a vassal state of another major power. Chapter 84 Severe Drought. The Texas colony, now under French control, developed rapidly. Not only did it quickly solve its own military expenses, but by 1838 it was even paying taxes to the French, making them feel they had made a huge profit. In contrast, the United States, due to defeat and economic crisis, was plunged into turmoil. Especially with the addition of a powerful neighbor like France, Americans' sense of security was shattered. Even amidst the economic crisis, they expanded their standing army to 65,000, almost double its previous size. But the U.S. military still felt it wasn't enough. The shock of the Battle of Texas had been too great for the Americans. The French army's superior firepower, iron discipline, and unwavering will meant that even though the American forces far outnumbered the French troops stationed in Texas, they still felt insecure. However, in public relations efforts to save face, the U.S. government insisted that France had 20,000 cavalry and 50,000 infantry in Texas, a numerical superiority over the U.S. forces. Furthermore, the U.S. claimed that its initial defeat was due to a treacherous surprise attack, and that the French army's morale was low, its fighting spirit weak, and that it was an army poisoned by feudal monarchical ideology. Ultimately, under pressure from the military, then U.S. President Martin Van Buren signed another presidential order expanding the U.S. Army to 100,000 troops. This further exacerbated the U.S. economic crisis. Fortunately, a disaster in Europe at this time saved the U.S. economy. A sudden heat wave swept across Europe, with temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius in most of southwestern Europe. Athens, also located on the Mediterranean coast and usually enjoying a pleasant climate, was also affected. The sudden heat wave made Otto very uncomfortable, causing him to miss the days of air conditioning in his previous life. However, he didn't have much free time to reminisce. His butler, West, reported a problem that made him realize something, prompting him to immediately convene a cabinet meeting. The persistent high temperatures had caused widespread drought in Western and Central Europe. Despite the Royal Consortium's extensive irrigation systems, the report from West indicated that if the heat wave continued, most of the agricultural companies' farms in Europe would suffer poor harvests or even total crop failure this year. Austria, situated on the Danube plain with its dense network of rivers, is considered one of the most suitable regions for agriculture in Central Europe and has long been an agricultural exporter, with agricultural companies investing heavily in farms. However, according to gathered intelligence, as the drought continues, more and more areas are experiencing water shortages, with lakes and swamps within Austria showing signs of drying up, causing headaches for Austrian officials. Even Austria is facing difficulties. France, Spain, and parts of Germany are in dire straits. French agriculture has been severely damaged, and grain prices in Germany have begun to rise. Seeing the dire situation, people began hoarding food, causing prices to soar and leading to famines in many areas. French agriculture had been struggling in recent years, so the French had a long-standing habit of stockpiling food and were temporarily spared. However, in Spain, Germany, and the drought-stricken southern Apennine Peninsula, people were already starving. While the entire Midwestern Europe was in dire straits, American food production remained unaffected, and large farms invested in by agricultural companies in California were expected to have a bumper harvest. Coupled with the Mexican Civil War, hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, and much farmland was abandoned, leading to food shortages in Mexico, which likely allowed them to make a fortune. Mexicans, facing a constant stream of illegal U.S. immigrants crossing the border, simply arrested and executed them, further escalating tensions between Mexico and the United States. Conversely, Chinese immigrants arriving in California, due to their skin color similar to that of Native Americans, were largely misidentified by the Mexican government as indigenous people and received little attention. The Mexican government was simply curious about how these Greeks had managed to tame so many Native Americans to work for them. According to the Agricultural Department's estimates, not only will there be widespread crop failures this year, but vineyards across the country are also facing the same problem. At the cabinet meeting, the Minister of Agriculture presented the latest domestic agricultural report, and all the cabinet ministers present wore grave expressions. This is truly the worst news, they thought to themselves, while also feeling a sense of relief. Because domestic food production had consistently failed to meet demand, Greece had long ago passed a national food reserve plan, and last year, under Otto's orders, further increased the scale of domestic food reserves. Last year, Europe enjoyed a bumper harvest, and many cabinet ministers felt that Otto's repeated expansion of grain reserves was simply throwing money away, since storing grain also costs money. Every year, the government has to replace a batch of old grain, and the price of old grain is not as good as that of new grain, so it's a losing proposition. But who could have imagined that Europe would suddenly experience widespread high temperatures? If it weren't for Otto's grain reserve plan, those of you sitting here today probably wouldn't even be able to stay seated. Actually, Otto was also somewhat surprised. He had originally anticipated, based on intelligence, that Europe might experience an artificially lowered grain production, so he made some preparations in advance. But now it seems that Otto's previous preparations were too conservative. If he had stockpiled more food, he probably could have gained even more. It just goes to show that things are unpredictable and time travelers are not omnipotent. Prime Minister Sano stepped forward first, saying, "Your Majesty, there is currently a complete crop failure, and domestic food prices are rising rapidly. I believe we should open up the granaries to help farmers who are struggling to survive, and at the same time, issue a price control order to limit domestic food prices. I'm worried that if we limit domestic food prices, some merchants might buy up large quantities of domestic grain and ship it abroad for profit." The finance minister voiced his concern. "Even if we empty our domestic grain reserves, it won't be enough. Then we should ban grain exports, and severely punish anyone found guilty," Prime Minister Sanos said solemnly. "With such huge profits at stake, there's never a shortage of people willing to take risks. I think it would be better to use labor as a form of relief," the Minister of Transport said. The new 5-year plan includes many highway and railway projects, especially in mountainous areas, which are the most challenging part of the plan. "We can replace wages with food and hire farmers to build roads, since they won't have a harvest this year anyway. This way, people lacking food can get food and survive the disaster year, while also preventing grain merchants from reselling domestic grain." "That's a good idea," Otto nodded. "Go back and come up with a plan that, given this kind of natural disaster, this year's agricultural tax should be waived. Get all the farmers in the country involved in road construction, and take this opportunity to build more railways and highways so that the railway and highway network in Greece can be completed as soon as possible." "Yes, Your Majesty." The Minister of Transport immediately responded. Prime Minister Sano stepped forward again. "Your Majesty, the Work for Relief program can indeed solve the problem of farmers' food supply, but don't forget that we also have a large number of workers in our country. At current grain prices, their wages cannot afford food. If these workers all choose to build roads in exchange for grain, the domestic industry will inevitably suffer a huge blow. Therefore, restricting grain prices is also necessary. Indeed, grain should be sold, but it should be rationed," said the Minister of Industry and Commerce. "In our past 5-year plan, we completed the census and issued household registrations. Whether they are domestic citizens or foreign workers, they all have household registrations or work certificates issued by us. We can sell low-priced grain based on these certificates, with a limit on the amount per person per month. This way, the people in the country can have access to cheap food, and it will also prevent merchants from buying up large quantities of food from the country and shipping it abroad. But this would put too much work on the government, and it would be difficult to guarantee that nothing will go wrong," Prime Minister Sanos said, frowning. "It's true that it's hard to guarantee there won't be problems, but if they simply sell the grain at a low price, even if grain exports are banned, these unscrupulous merchants will find a way. Don't forget, Greece is surrounded by sea on 3 sides, and many cities are located on the coast. These merchants can easily transport the grain to remote docks at night, load it onto ships, and ship it abroad. However, our maritime patrol fleet is limited in number, and the sea area is too vast, making it difficult to thoroughly inspect every passing vessel. Smuggling is already rampant, and countless smugglers are caught every year. Now, faced with huge profits, those smugglers will certainly try every means to evade patrol inspections. Our domestic grain reserves are only enough for our own use. If large quantities of grain are smuggled away by these smugglers, the situation will be much more serious if there is a food shortage in the country." Chapter 85 Expansion Ambition. After some discussion, the cabinet finally approved the Minister of Industry and Commerce's proposal to sell low-priced food in limited quantities using household registration certificates. Currently, European countries do not have detailed population statistics or the habit of registering households. They only have rough estimates of their population and do not issue any household registration certificates. Greece's practice was actually a habit brought over by Otto's previous reign, and it was also to facilitate the confirmation of the country's population situation and to facilitate military service and reserve training. Unexpectedly, It came in handy during the food crisis. This also made the cabinet ministers realize that this household registration system had many advantages. With household registration as a basis, many government tasks became much more efficient. Remember the initial website domain name. To ensure everything went smoothly, government personnel were mobilized, and the army was also deployed to maintain order at government-established food distribution points to prevent looting or riots. Having settled the domestic issues in Greece, Otto turned his attention abroad. This severe drought in Europe was both a crisis and an opportunity. The drought had led to a large influx of refugees in Central and Western Europe, and European countries were now highly hostile towards refugees, as they were often seen as a source of unrest. Typically, these countries solve refugee problems through relief efforts. If there isn't enough food, they simply drive the refugees to other countries or colonies to fend for themselves. However, Otto viewed these refugees as wealth. While mainland Greece might not be able to fully accommodate them, he had two large colonies in Central and Southern Africa, and the west coast of North America also needed a large influx of immigrants. Settling these refugees in the colonies would allow them to cultivate wasteland, accelerating colonial development, and also solve their livelihood problems, at least ensuring their survival. In fact, Otto had already written to Ludwig I, hoping he could use his influence to help the Royal Financial Group gather refugees from Bavaria and even Germany, and then transport them to the colonies. Although agricultural companies' farms across Central and Western Europe also experienced significant crop failures this year, these farms have always maintained food reserves. Large farms in places like the Apennine Peninsula and Austria could easily use some of their reserves to feed local refugees en route to the colonies. Colonial farms also have regular food reserves. Even if there are shortages, they can urgently plant edible crops, and increased fishing can also alleviate some of the food problem. With the abundant natural resources and sparsely populated nature of Central and Southern Africa, they can always find a way to solve the food problem. Once immigrants arrive in the colonies, they are unlikely to starve. If all else fails, emergency food supplies can be imported from the US and Russia, but in the current situation, these will likely be overpriced. During this busy farming season, Greece is busy implementing food rationing. Otto is gathering large numbers of refugees across Europe, and other countries are implementing their own measures. France chose to transport a large number of French people to its Texas colony, quickly bringing the French population there to parity with the Americans, leading to a rapid increase in Texas's population. Because Texas was unaffected by the European drought and could supply food to mainland France, coupled with domestic food reserves, the French managed to weather this crisis. Seeing the immense role played by the North American colonies, providing emergency food supplies and producing large quantities of cotton in times of crisis, the French felt a stark contrast to their own colony in Algeria, North Africa. As early as 1830, France had dispatched troops to Algeria, completing its occupation. However, resistance from the native Arabs and Berbers never ceased, and the war had dragged on for nearly 8 years, making Algeria a huge burden for the French government. The constant Algerian uprisings, along with the unruly indigenous tribes, were a major headache for the French expeditionary force in Algeria. Even with victories in every battle, the exhausting fighting left the French army unable to celebrate their wins. Desperate, the French ultimately chose to build fortifications along the highways, implementing a long-term siege to encircle and divide the resistance forces. However, this counterinsurgency campaign showed no signs of ending. In contrast, the takeover of the Texas colony was remarkably smooth, encountering virtually no resistance and quickly yielding substantial returns for France. Therefore, France planned to immigrate 200,000 people to Texas within 5 years, then continue expanding in North America, ultimately creating another France. The United States' frenzied military expansion next door made the French feel threatened, leading them to discuss sending additional troops to the colonies. The governor of Texas objected, believing that Texas was in a critical period. The situation in North America was interconnected, and France's priority at this stage was to completely stabilize Texas. At this crucial moment, there was no need to further provoke Americans and Mexicans. The severe drought in Europe alleviated the American economic crisis and also brought huge profits to Russia, a grain exporter. Many European nobles and wealthy merchants even had to flee to Russia to escape the summer heat. In those days, there weren't many ways to escape the heat. Ordinary people could only soak in the water, while wealthy merchants and nobles chose to travel to cooler places. As a result, Russia, which was previously considered a barren land, experienced a surge in tourists. Just when people thought the sweltering heat was about to end and breathed a sigh of relief, a strong convective weather system visited the region. Coupled with a typhoon that arrived as expected, it brought widespread torrential rains, resulting in severe flooding in Central and Western Europe after a period of drought. Large areas of farmland in southern France were submerged, and major cities such as Paris and Lyon suffered varying degrees of damage. Like the grapes in Greek vineyards, the damage to French grapes was equally severe, and wine prices are expected to rise sharply next year. Austria is experiencing widespread flooding, with the Danube River basin in despair. The drought combined with the current floods has caused significant damage to Prussian agriculture, and Poland has suffered similar devastation. Many Polish cities are built along the river, and the sudden floods have destroyed numerous cities. Yet Nicholas I has made no preparations for disaster relief. The Polish people's repeated uprisings and defiant attitude have prompted the Russians to seize the opportunity to raise taxes and completely eliminate the Polish aristocracy. In many ways, this natural disaster has inadvertently done Russia a great favor. Greece is also within the affected area, although the impact is less severe compared to these countries, but the country is already in a state of emergency, with various construction projects being launched one after another. The poor harvest will cause a sharp drop in Greece's fiscal revenue this year, but thanks to ample preparation, domestic transportation infrastructure will see a significant improvement. Inside the Athens royal palace, Otto looked at two maps hanging on the wall. These were two relatively detailed colonial maps, one of the Congo colony and the other of the newly established Greek East African colony. Both maps clearly marked the surrounding geography, with multiple points and a large circle. Looking closely at the areas circled on the two maps, the one of the Congo colony roughly encompassed the central and western regions of what would later become the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Republic of Congo, as well as parts of Angola. The East African map included most of what would later become Tanzania. Wester, make copies of these two sets of data and send them to the colonies in Central and Southern Africa. Arrange for the newly arrived immigrants in these designated areas. Otto was ambitiously implementing a new colonial plan. Send another regiment of the Guards to East Africa. Many areas there are newly developed and need sufficient troops to ensure the safety of the immigrants. But this will leave only 2 regiments of the Guards on the mainland, West reminded him at this point. Then let's expand the army further, increasing the Guards to 2 infantry divisions. This will also ensure our colony rotation plan. Have the colony's guard stationed separately at new immigrant settlements, managing and maintaining the planned settlements. We also need to strengthen the management and education of subsequent immigrants, and find manpower directly from graduating students at teacher training colleges if needed. Otto seemed quite spirited at this point. Also, we must be cautious about distributing weapons to immigrants. Currently, in the Congo colony, local militias can only be formed at the first established settlements, and weapons and ammunition must be strictly managed and kept in the hands of our own people, the agricultural companies. As he gave instructions, Otto was still thinking about what he might have forgotten. Select a few trustworthy people from the royal consortium, preferably native Greeks with families, to take over the management of the core colonies. These core locations can't remain under the control of the Janissaries indefinitely. Their most important task is still the security of the colonies. Okay, that's all for now. Get on with it. Chapter 86 Colonial Expansion. Taking advantage of this rare natural disaster, immigrants from Central and Western Europe provided Otto with the confidence to engage in large-scale land enclosure in his colonies in Central and Southern Africa. Otto had always been very attentive to the construction and development of his colonies, because the colonies in Central and Southern Africa were not only a crucial cornerstone for Greece's future rise, but also a fallback plan for himself. With Otto's order, new directives, along with immigrants and supplies, crossed the ocean to the 2 major colonies in eastern and western Central and Southern Africa. Following Otto's orders, the Congo colony and the Greek East African colonies successively began their enclosure movement. Find Taiwanese novels at Taiwan Novel Network, the most complete collection. In New Nafplio, today, the physically strong immigrants selected from the surrounding colonial outposts who have undergone basic military training are chosen and further trained by the local sheriff to form the local militia. A long line stretches before the main gate of Nafplio's city center. These are the recruits who have passed the initial selection from the surrounding outposts, and are now registering. Name: Ardas. Age 24. Ardas then saw the recorder write his name and age on the record sheet, with a number 01453 at the end. He was then handed a cardboard card with the same number printed on it. "Take this number and go to the fourth window over there to collect your equipment," the recorder instructed. The so-called equipment was actually a brand new military uniform. As for the musket, it would be issued after training began at the military camp. The militiamen's uniforms were similar to those of the Greek regular army, but with a slight difference. The uniforms were generally light green, and they wore cloth-peaked caps that provided good sun protection and breathability. Their boots were not the typical European military boots, but rather yellow-green cloth shoes. After receiving his equipment, Ardas followed instructions and left the city center, arriving at a military camp on the outskirts of the stronghold. With the help of the soldiers guarding the camp, he found his platoon, the 3rd Platoon. Currently, the entire Novo Nafplio, including the surrounding strongholds, is home to over 32,000 immigrants, and 800 immigrants have been selected to participate in this militia training. After their training, the militia would be responsible for maintaining order in New Nafplio, patrolling the surrounding areas, and clearing out any remaining indigenous inhabitants. This was only the first group of militiamen to receive training. More immigrants would gradually follow suit. Essentially, all men of working age would undergo training and then take turns serving in local defense positions. Once the militia reached a certain size, the Congolese colony could then redeploy its guards to newly established colonial outposts in more dangerous locations. These inland areas, lacking large-scale expulsion of wildlife and indigenous tribes, were generally considered more dangerous. To ensure the smooth establishment of new settlements, the guards originally stationed at various colonial outposts were redeployed to participate in the reclamation activities. The guards' primary task was to clear out the native inhabitants along the way and create a safe new road for subsequent immigrant migration. Their original duties were transferred to newly formed local militias. As the main military force for colonial expansion, these guards had heavy responsibilities. Upon reaching their destinations, they also had to clear out wild animals and native tribes near the new settlements. Otto chose to occupy areas suitable for human habitation and reproduction, ensuring a good surrounding environment and attracting a large number of native tribes. Following Greek practice in establishing colonial settlements, to prevent local indigenous groups from threatening the safety of immigrants, the guards would clear and expel these indigenous tribes near the planned settlements before the immigrants arrived. Simultaneously, the new colonial settlements would become the core hubs of the surrounding area, and with the addition of checkpoints along the routes, a relatively secure immigration network could be established. Unfortunately, the inland regions of the Congo colony had vast tracts of tropical rainforest, unsuitable for immigrant settlement. Therefore, some of the planned settlements were built along the edge of the rainforest, forming a linear pattern, rather than a network like in Greek East Africa, and the number of settlements was also slightly less. Along with the immigrants came a large amount of supplies transported from Europe. Because the colonies were generally very underdeveloped, a large quantity of supplies needed to be shipped from Europe, and even used to supply the people within the colonial settlements. At this time, the most expensive items in the colony's general stores were pocket watches. Each large farm in the colony only had 2 or 3 large clocks to tell time. Of course, to facilitate people's lives, a bell ringer would ring the time at set times. The immigrants in these settlements would arrange their daily activities according to the bells. Besides the busy farming season, the immigrants weren't completely idle during their free time. They also had to undertake some of the tasks related to settlement and road construction. Meanwhile, local teachers and missionaries also teach these immigrants Greek language and culture according to the curriculum, recount Greek history, and encourage them to study hard, pass the examinations as soon as possible, become true Greeks, and obtain better treatment. In the early colonial settlements, the teaching of Greek is still progressing with difficulty. The immigrants in these settlements speak a wide variety of languages, so having a unified, mutually intelligible language as a standard means everyone inevitably learns together to facilitate communication. Now, apart from their own homes, these immigrants, whether actively or passively, are gradually using Greek as the primary language for everyday conversation. While accents were inevitable, they were still within comprehensible range. The key challenge was learning the script, which proved quite a headache for these predominantly adult immigrants. However, learning Greek was also closely linked to their own interests. Passing the Greek language exam would increase their monthly salary by 10%. Upon reaching the required years of immigration and passing the relevant language exam, they could even earn up to 40% more. Even so, many immigrants, despite the headache, diligently studied Greek. Compared to the annoyance of learning Greek, what they truly enjoyed most was listening to the stories told by the teachers and missionaries after completing their formal courses. The colonial teachers lectured on Greek institutions and culture, Greek myths and historical stories, ancient Greek heroes, past wars and major events, and even the modern Greek War of Independence against the Ottomans. With limited entertainment options, this fresh knowledge and these stories became the immigrants' leisure time. The material presented by these teachers was actually compiled and printed into books by scholars at Otto's behest. Naturally, some personal interpretations were also included, such as the claim that the people living on the Apennine Peninsula were descended from the people of the greater Greek city-states of ancient Greece, and that some Greeks had migrated to Central Europe and Asia Minor. In short, the story connects Greeks to people from all over the world, showing that everyone actually has Greek blood. The reason they don't know this is simply because the tradition has been gradually lost over time. These stories, embellished by writers, are anything but dull. The plots are full of twists and turns, captivating these immigrants who don't usually have much entertainment. Even after the stories are finished, these immigrants will still discuss the content with lingering interest, subtly leading them to believe that they too can be considered Greek to some extent. Chapter 87: The Turmoil in London. Europe entered 1838 amidst turmoil. As the only European nation to have fully industrialized at that time, Britain was hailed as the workshop of the world. To shed its centuries-old image as a pirate, the British vigorously promoted the parliamentary democracy, portraying themselves as civilized and progressive gentlemen. However, Otto believed that Britain's so-called democracy was merely a product of collusion between the aristocracy and capitalists. Only those with assets possessed the right to vote and be elected. The voices of the penniless workers and farmers, despite their daily toil, remained silenced in Parliament. Yet, with the deepening of industrialization, Britain's urban population rapidly increased, and the working class grew exponentially. Compared to farmers, these workers possessed greater organization and discipline, and their relatively concentrated nature gradually led them to form organized groups. By 1838, the urban population of Britain had reached 48% of the total population, which also rapidly increased the conflict between the rich and poor. Especially with the increasing frequency of economic exchanges between Britain and Greece, the Greek regulations on employment in enterprises, a law known to workers as the Labour Protection Act, gradually became known to the British working class. Currently, a 16-hour workday is widely practiced in Britain. Workers have no disability benefits, and their incomes are constantly decreasing. After the initial market boom ended, capitalists began to further exploit their workers. In 1804, a worker could earn 15 shillings a week, but now, not only were workers more overworked, they only received 10 shillings. Some capitalists even used goods in lieu of wages, often unsold or substandard products. Some mine owners even forced miners to work on ores with no value for smelting. The workers had no recourse, as this was all permitted under British law. Child labor was commonplace in factories, as they were paid only half the price of adults. Long-standing oppression finally sparked rebellion. On this day, London streets were packed with people. Ragged workers gathered and marched across London Bridge in a massive wave. The entire London police force was mobilized, but manpower was still insufficient due to the sheer number of workers. The cabinet held an emergency meeting to discuss the sudden workers' demonstration. Palmerston advocated for complete suppression, and Viscount Melbourne knew that the problem must be resolved before it escalated. To prevent any serious incidents, Viscount Melbourne summoned the Duke of Wellington, who was already semi-retired, and requested that he assemble troops to suppress the workers' uprising if necessary. Originally, the workers' unions would have submitted a petition to Parliament in 1837, primarily demanding universal suffrage, the so-called People's Charter. However, perhaps due to the butterfly effect of Otto's influence, the workers, now aware of Greek labor protection laws, gathered to demand not only universal suffrage but also, more significantly, that Britain enact laws similar to those in Greece to protect workers' interests. Faced with these demands, many capitalists declared they would rather relocate their factories to France or even the United States if the bill were passed. This labor protection bill further exacerbated the conflict between workers and the bourgeoisie. Emboldening many representatives of the bourgeoisie, at the Royal Palace in Athens, Otto reviewed intelligence from Britain. Urged by numerous members of Parliament, the Duke of Wellington's army had forcefully suppressed a London workers' march. In his recollection, this hadn't happened. Although the London Workers' Union's proposed People's Charter had been repeatedly rejected, the British Army had forcefully suppressed the marching workers, as soldiers were reluctant to fire on their own countrymen. Now, however, the marching group, after refusing to disperse, was being suppressed by the army, resulting in hundreds of worker deaths and injuries. Faced with fully armed troops, the unarmed workers had no choice but to scatter and flee. Otto quickly noticed that the workers' demands included provisions for labor protection, leading him to deduce a possible reason for the British crackdown. A pall of gloom hung over the workers of London, while the capitalists celebrated their great victory. At this very moment, Alexander, who had been traveling for his studies, finally arrived at the London docks and was received by Queen Victoria. Upon first seeing Victoria, Alexander expressed his love. The two were of similar age, with Alexander only a year older than Victoria, and his outrageous behavior did not displease her. On the contrary, Alexander, handsome and dashing in his military uniform, captivated a newly enthroned queen upon their first meeting, and she praised him for his wit and humor. The two then dined in St. George's Hall, where Alexander escorted Victoria into the hall. The young woman's heart fluttered, and they danced together, sharing a joyful time. Even after they parted and returned to their room, Victoria, still excited, didn't fall asleep until dawn. The next day, they met again, and Alexander declared he would never forget those happy days. Victoria was completely smitten. They met many times, watching horse races together, dancing at Buckingham Palace, and had several private dates. At this point, British officials sensed something was amiss. Many were terrified, judging from the Queen's demeanor. Her reception was clearly not polite. They couldn't imagine the two of them getting together. The same news reached St. Petersburg at this time, causing even the previously cheerful Tsar Nicholas I to be greatly alarmed. He immediately dispatched an envoy demanding Alexander's return to St. Petersburg. Alexander quickly bound the envoy sent by his father and threw him into the Thames, continuing to accompany the Queen on horseback rides, hunts, and dances every day. Young, handsome, and assertive princes always easily capture the hearts of young women, and this was no exception for the 19-year-old Queen of England. Seeing things increasingly escalating towards the worst possible outcome, the British ministers could no longer remain passive. Viscount Melbourne made it very clear that he opposed any involvement between Britain and the wildly expanding Russia, demanding that Queen Victoria immediately sever ties with Alexander II. Every servant and lady-in-waiting at Windsor Castle received strict orders to report Alexander and Queen Victoria's movements at all times, preventing them from doing anything rash. Meanwhile, the Queen's family and friends joined the persuasion effort, and Alexander encountered the Tsar's second envoy, who was preparing to forcibly take him back to St. Petersburg. Not all British people opposed the union. Some believed it could unite the two most powerful nations in the world, and that a British-Russian alliance would be unstoppable. But truly rational people know that the conflict of national interests cannot be bridged by the love of a young couple. In the struggle for global hegemony, there can only be one victor. Ultimately, facing immense pressure, the two young people had no choice but to painfully choose to abandon their love. Perhaps they thought how wonderful it would be if they weren't the Queen and the future Tsar. Perhaps they could be with their loved ones. However, as the current or future leaders of their nations, they had no choice. The conflict between Britain and Russia over global hegemony was irreconcilable. Even if they forced themselves to stay together, there would be no future. Alexander appeared melancholy after leaving London, but Otto knew that he would soon fall in love again in Paris, and Victoria would meet her true love in the future. Chapter 88 Anglo-American Conflict. The world in 1838 remained turbulent. The natural disasters in Europe successfully saved American agriculture, and the devastating Mexican Civil War provided a significant boost to the United States, which was struggling with an economic crisis. As the effects of the economic crisis slowly subsided, the United States, with its vast territory and 17 million people, was destined to become a force to be reckoned with in the world. Originally, the United States planned to annex Texas, using it as a foundation to gradually conquer New Mexico and California, dominating both oceans and laying a solid foundation for its manifest destiny. Unfortunately, France seized Texas at this time, interrupting its first step of expansion. Mexico temporarily quelled its internal strife, and the United States would need to make greater efforts to achieve this. A three-way struggle for supremacy was unfolding in North America. Strictly speaking, the United States was the strongest power in North America, but the United States, still recovering from its previous setbacks, hoped that France and Mexico could fight each other to a standstill. Meanwhile, the United States encountered a new problem. Canadian rebels attacked Toronto, and a daring American merchant was using the transport ship Caroline to supply weapons to the rebels. Upon receiving this information, the British dispatched a force to the American port of Schlesien and destroyed the ship. This incident caused a huge uproar. The local government of Schlesien claimed that the British had violated American sovereignty, while the British commander stated that it was merely legitimate self-defense. Initially, the two countries did not engage in much dispute, but at this point, the British military commander stated that the Americans were supplying weapons to the rebels and sending military personnel into a British colony, a blatant act of invasion. The London press was thrown into a frenzy, with various conspiracy theories emerging, suggesting that the United States was likely behind the rebellion in the Canadian colonies, and that the Americans were preparing to overthrow British rule in Canada to pave the way for American annexation. This sudden surge of speculation caused a major uproar in the British Parliament, with past American actions being brought up again. John Adams, the second President of the United States, had publicly stated, "The United States is destined to expand throughout the entire western part of the Northern Hemisphere." It was clear to everyone that the Americans had always coveted the Canadian colonies. Thomas Jefferson, the third President of the United States, also spoke of annexing Canadian territories, including Quebec, aiming to advance towards Halifax and ultimately expel British influence from the Americas. Moreover, just over 20 years earlier, the United States had actively invaded Canada, a fact the British hadn't easily forgotten. The actions of the Americans in Texas particularly alarmed the British. Like Texas, the Canadian colonies were sparsely populated, and the actions of the Americans in Texas could be easily replicated in Canada. Coupled with Britain's forceful suppression of worker protests, which exacerbated domestic tensions, the cabinet, initially reluctant to escalate tensions with the Americans, was forced to take a hard line to divert the attention of immigrants. Britain then drafted a strongly worded letter to the Americans, questioning why they had participated in the rebellion in the Canadian colonies, provided weapons to the rebels, and whether they intended to disregard the sovereignty of the United Kingdom and treat Canada as American territory. This letter caused a huge uproar in the U.S. Congress. Many members clamored for war with Britain, demanding freedom and democracy be brought to Britain, while others demanded reparations. However, most members rationally argued that the British stance should be taken seriously, given the watchful eyes of France and Mexico on the borders. Provoking conflict with Britain at this time would be tantamount to placing the Americans in an encirclement by enemies. The U.S. president could only strengthen border security while publicly stating that the Americans in Canada were ordinary civilians, not military personnel, and had been deceived by the rebels. The U.S. would not intervene in Canada's internal affairs and was willing to compensate Britain for its losses. The British themselves were also unwilling to start a war in North America, as conquering the current United States would be too costly and not worthwhile for Britain. The British were only worried about the U.S. potentially encroaching on Canada, and seeing the Americans back down, they did not pursue the matter further, as Britain still needed American food and cotton. Otto felt somewhat disappointed upon receiving the news, but he also knew that the top leaders of both Britain and the United States were rational enough, and that the two countries' economies were closely intertwined, making a violent conflict unlikely. This outcome was not unexpected. At this time, the Greek government launched numerous projects, providing new sources of income for idle farmers and accelerating the progress of the new 5-year plan's transportation and water conservancy initiatives. In the new 5-year plan, the Greek government's goals were not significantly higher than the previous plan. This was mainly because Greece's territory was relatively small, and the first 5-year plan had already accomplished most of the work. For example, railways had connected the most important cities in Greece, water infrastructure in the Thessalonians was largely complete, and major ports had been dredged and rebuilt. This new 5-year plan primarily focuses on further improving the domestic railway network, adding double tracks to some important routes, expanding the national highway network, deepening basic education, and improving the domestic strategic material reserve system. In terms of the overall scale of the projects, the new 5-year plan is less extensive than the previous one, requiring less funding, thus providing the Greek government with some financial leeway. In the previous 5-year plan, the Greek government borrowed a large sum of money to complete numerous projects, and even though government revenue has increased with economic development, debt has also grown accordingly. Given the current financial situation of the Greek government, it is expected to repay a large portion of its existing foreign debt within the next 5 years, while gradually reclaiming equity in some domestic railways and heavy industries. Prime Minister Sanos has even set his sights on colonies in Central and Southern Africa. He is already discussing with Otto the possibility of investing in these colonies in a year or two once the government has a sufficient surplus. Otto's initial proposal to develop the Congo colony was rejected by Prime Minister Sanos on the grounds that the government lacked the funds. However, with the development of the Congolese colony, the cultivation of cash crops such as cotton, sisal, and sugarcane brought considerable economic returns. Although the quantities were limited, the potential was clearly huge. The colony brought Greece cheap raw materials. After all, the cost of goods transported from the colony was low, and no tariffs were required, so prices naturally came down. If Otto hadn't consistently increased investment in the Congolese colony and consciously expanded its scale, the colony could have achieved a balance of payments within 10 years. Although Otto kept news of the colony a secret, he certainly couldn't completely hide it from the Greek cabinet. After realizing that investing in the colony was a good business, Prime Minister Sanos also had the idea of investing in the colony. Of course, this will require negotiations with Otto and the Royal Consortium, given that they have invested countless sums over the past 3 years in developing the colonies in Central and Southern Africa. Now, the colonies are beginning to show initial returns, although not yet enough to fully cover the costs of continued expansion, but the future looks promising. Without paying some price, Prime Minister Sanos will likely find it difficult for the Greek government to easily intervene in the colony's affairs. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 89: The Angry Sultan. The Greek government had its sights set on the profits from its colonies in Central and Southern Africa and was preparing to invest there. Otto was actually happy to see this, as it would help strengthen ties between the Greek homeland and the colonies, increasing the colony's sense of belonging. However, the specific conditions certainly needed to be carefully negotiated, at least ensuring that the Royal Consortium could recoup its huge investment in the colonies as soon as possible. Especially this year's wave of immigration and land grabbing had required the Royal Consortium to go to great lengths to raise funds and mobilize resources, even impacting the group's development. This operation by the Royal Consortium resulted in Otto relocating a large number of European refugees to Central and Southern Africa. In the eyes of Europeans, Africa was a wild and desolate land, rife with disease and cannibalistic natives. Otto mostly recruited destitute refugees. Because they had nothing left, and staying would only mean starvation, they figured it was better to go to Africa and gamble on an uncertain future. Those refugees with even a little bit of capital mostly went to the New World. Otto didn't have many options. He could only try to recruit skilled refugees to work in Greece, giving them more choices. After all, a ticket to America might be too expensive for these refugees, even if they spent their entire family's savings. A mishap with storms or pirates could mean drowning at sea, or they might even be tricked into becoming slaves, working daily in cotton fields. Over the years, Otto had been spreading damaging information about the United States throughout Europe. His newspapers, which he invested in around the world, reported on European immigrants being tricked into becoming plantation owners' slaves. It was better to stay in Europe and try one's luck in Greece, since Greece directly covered travel expenses for those with technical skills. Many of these people planned to return home after the disaster, but some always stayed, which was beneficial to Greece. Because of Otto's actions, the number of refugees heading to the United States decreased significantly, which might have been a good thing for them as well. After all, at this time, the American economy had not fully recovered, and job opportunities were scarce. If they couldn't find suitable work and integrate into local life, they faced certain death. At this time, 4 main railway lines in Greece were completed: the Myssoni-Sparta-Corinth-Athens line, the Athens-Malis-Larissa-Katerina line, the Trikala-Larissa-Volos line, and the Kanarachin-Kalambuka-Trikala line. There were also the Peloponnese Ring Railway line, the Kanarachin-Alta-Palaris-Sermon line, and the Athens-Italican-Palaris line. Only parts of these 3 lines had been completed in the previous 5-year plan. In addition, numerous branch lines connecting various towns and cities throughout the country were still under construction. Once these railway lines were completed, Athens' railway network would be largely formed, with a total length exceeding 1,400 kilometers, twice that of present-day France, 6 times that of Prussia, and nearly half that of British railways. At this time, Britain possessed the world's longest railway network at 3,100 kilometers, and its railways were poised for explosive growth, rapidly reaching 12,000 kilometers by 1850. Historically, the United States at that time boasted an even longer railway network, reaching 14,000 kilometers, laying the foundation for the future economic boom of both Britain and the United States. Otto didn't have such grand ambitions. In reality, the existing railway lines were already sufficient for Greece's needs, and even exceeded some limits. The new railway lines in the new 5-year plan were now relatively difficult to construct, with numerous mountains and seemingly short distances, but the scale of the projects was much larger. Along with the railways, a large number of highways were also under construction. The Greek government intended to take advantage of the cheap labor available during this natural disaster to thoroughly complete the coastal and inland road network, boosting the economy of the Greek mountain regions. After sketching on the map for a while, Otto finally stopped, looking thoughtfully at Natasha. This made Natasha feel a chill involuntarily. Whenever Otto showed such an expression, she always felt that he seemed to have the ability to see through everything. Otto wished he could truly see through everything, but he couldn't. All he had were deductions based on his past life's memories combined with the current situation. Suddenly, Otto spoke up. Natasha, if Egypt and the Ottoman Empire were to go to war, who do you think would win? Huh? Why are you suddenly saying this? Are Egypt and the Ottoman Empire about to go to war? Natasha asked, startled. Yes, even if some people don't want it, others will still make them fight. Otto said, looking towards Constantinople, the Ottoman capital, Istanbul. At this time, in the Grand Salakari Palace of the Ottoman Sultan, the current Sultan Mahmud I and the Ottoman Grand Vizier Felchak awaited their guests. In future Turkish history books, these two would be infamous as a traitorous duo. The French occupied Algeria, Tunisia and Greece gained independence, northern Serbia achieved autonomy or near independence, Egypt gained independence and conquered Syria, and the Russians were able to extend their influence to Wallachia and Moldavia, acquiring the right to protect the Orthodox Christians of these countries, among other things. All of this occurred during the reign of Mahmud I and the rule of Felchak. The Ottoman Empire suffered repeated defeats in foreign wars, a crushing defeat in the 8th Russo-Turkish War, the First Turkish-Egyptian War, the Battle of Navarre, and the War for Greek independence. Countless unequal treaties cemented their place in the annals of history, leaving them unable to escape shame. During this period, the Ottoman Empire signed numerous agreements with European powers, granting them countless privileges. However, these two leaders were quite different from the old Buddha of the Far Eastern Empire. They consistently strived to reverse the nation's fate. Many of Mahmud I's reforms were later adopted by Kemal Ataturk. Upon ascending the throne, Mahmud I immediately eliminated the Ottoman Empire's Janissary Guard, thus formally seizing power. The Janissary Guard had once been the Ottoman Empire's most powerful weapon, but by Mahmud I's time, it had become the most formidable and stubborn conservative faction within the empire. Those in charge of the Janissary Guard opposed all change. They controlled the country's strongest army and had even murdered the former sultan, Mahmud I's father, in their opposition to reform. Without eliminating them, the country could not be changed, and the Ottoman Empire would continue its rapid decline. Mahmud I learned from his father's mistakes and made preparations in advance. In 1807, when the Janissaries marched menacingly towards the Sultan's palace, intending to repeat past coups, they were met by a newly trained army secretly trained by Mahmud I. Half an hour later, this army, which had once struck fear into the hearts of Europeans, was utterly defeated. Mahmud I completely eradicated the Janissaries' power and abolished the outdated juramnatory system. Mahmud I then began reforming the army, hiring a Prussian officer, the future renowned Moltke the Elder, as his advisor. From this time onward, the Ottoman Empire and Prussia began exchanging military cadets and officers, and the Ottoman army continuously learned from Prussia. Later, Mahmud I abolished the outdated timah system and tax farming, promulgated a new legal code, greatly strengthened central authority and Ottoman revenue, abolished papal authority, and encouraged industrial and commercial development. Starting in 1824, the Ottoman Empire began implementing compulsory education, reopening many closed universities, and sending students to countries such as England, France, and Prussia. After his defeat to Mehmed Ali in the First Ottoman War, Mahmud I quickly rebuilt the Ottoman navy and began establishing arsenals, modeled after European designs, to develop new firearms. From all this, it is clear that Mahmud I was neither a mediocre monarch nor a ruler with outdated ideas. Faced with the Ottoman crisis, he continuously strived to change the status quo, but as his reforms deepened, he encountered increasing resistance. Furthermore, the spread of nationalism and the awakening of national consciousness among various ethnic groups within the country further embroiled the Ottoman Empire in complex ethnic issues. Britain, France, and Russia were constantly encroaching on the interests of the Ottoman Empire in various ways. Beset by internal and external troubles, the Ottoman Empire was unable to secure a stable external environment, preventing Mahmud I from focusing on domestic issues and hindering reform efforts. At this time, news brought by British Foreign Secretary Palmerston further enraged Mahmud I. Chapter 90 The British Proposal. Palmerston strode into Mahmud I's palace. Even in the Ottoman court, he remained arrogant, offering only a slight bow to Mahmud I as a gesture of respect. Mahmud I and Grand Vizier Filchek exchanged glances at Palmerston's impudent behavior, but neither were reprimanded him, for at this time, Britain was the Ottoman Empire's greatest support. "Your Excellency the Sultan," Palmerston said, "you should not sheath your sword, but use it to punish those wicked men." Mahmud I understood his meaning perfectly. Britain wanted him to wage war against Egypt and reclaim its rule. Of course, he also knew that the British were encouraging him because the current ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, was secretly opposing Britain, selling Egypt's cotton harvest to France and other countries while ignoring British trade requests. In fact, Mahmud I harbored deep resentment towards Ali, but he knew that the Ottoman Empire was not yet prepared for war. At this time, the Ottoman Empire possessed nearly 400,000 troops, more than double the size of Egypt's army, and its navy outwardly surpassed Egypt's. However, Mahmud I had two concerns. First, the French were actively engaged in conflict with Egypt, even assisting in training its army. He could not ignore the possibility of French intervention. Most importantly, the Russians were eyeing the Ottoman Empire with predatory intent. The Russians had always been the Ottomans' most troublesome enemy, having amassed considerable wealth from the Ottomans in numerous Russo-Turkish wars, especially the most recent ones. Recently, Palmerston had repeatedly hinted that the Ottoman Empire should send troops to Egypt, but Mahmud I was unwilling to be used as a pawn, fearing that the Russians would take advantage of the situation. Therefore, he pretended not to understand. "Mr. Palmerston, I don't understand what you mean." "Your Excellency the Sultan, we have recently received news that the Egyptian Pasha, Muhammad Ali, has decided to grant Egypt independence and cease paying tribute to you. I think you know what this means. It is a complete provocation against your authority. He has the support of the French and is planning to launch a war against you to seize your kingdom." What? This news from Palmerston shocked Mahmud I. In his view, Muhammad Ali was a shrewd man and should have known very well that waging war with the Ottomans at this time could allow other countries to benefit. Therefore, the best option was to tacitly maintain the status quo. An open break would be an extremely foolish choice. Mahmud I's idea wasn't wrong, but he clearly overlooked Muhammad Ali's age. Ali, nearing 80, couldn't wait that long. To achieve his ambition of conquest before his death, Muhammad Ali chose a risky gamble. Mahmud I still didn't quite believe Muhammad Ali would do this. At this point, the tribute Egypt needed to pay was actually minimal, mostly symbolic, and insignificant to Egypt's current strength. But if Ali did indeed do this, even if Mahmud I didn't want war with Muhammad Ali now, he would have to declare war on Egypt to maintain the Ottoman Empire's prestige. To bolster Mahmud I's confidence, Palmerston said, "Your Excellency, you need not worry that Russia will take advantage of the situation. Britain will not stand idly by while Russia continues to annex Ottoman territory. Ensuring Russia's confinement to the Black Sea and preventing its access to the Mediterranean was Britain's most important strategy on the European continent." Furthermore, Palmerston himself strongly endorsed a Russian threat theory, believing that preventing further Russian expansion was in Britain's best interest. As for France's support for Egypt, he believed the French would soon be in a bind, and by early next year at the latest, they would realize that any attempt to break free from the shackles of the Vienna Treaty was futile. Mahmud I knew the man before him wasn't lying, but he still refused to send troops at this time. The Ottoman Empire was far from prepared. A third of its army hadn't yet undergone modernization, and even those equipped with new weapons lack sufficient combat capability. His military advisor, Moltke the Elder, bluntly stated that the Ottoman army was far from reaching the level of the armies of the major powers, even inferior to the ragtag army of the Austrian Empire. He truly had no guarantee of victory in a war with Egypt at this point. Palmerston, of course, noticed Mahmud I's thoughts, and at this moment he offered a prepared suggestion. If your Majesty the Sultan does not wish to declare war on Egypt directly for the time being, I have a way to cripple Egypt's economy. Once Egypt's economy collapses, Muhammad Ali will no longer be able to support his army, and will have no choice but to bow down to you. What exactly is this method? Mahmud I felt that things were not so simple, but if he could destroy Egypt's economy, it would certainly be a good thing for him. All we need is for the Ottoman Empire to sign an agreement with us, abolishing all monopolies within its borders, Palmerston bluntly stated, revealing the British plan. They could cripple the Egyptian economy without firing a single shot, while simultaneously allowing Britain to intervene and control the Egyptian, and even the Ottoman, economy. Would this really work? Mahmud I, lacking economic expertise, didn't immediately grasp the implications. That's right. Egypt has been militarily strong for years. The reason Muhammad Ali has so much money is because he monopolizes the three trades of tobacco, sugar, and cotton in Egypt, using the monopoly system to make a fortune. Once the monopoly system is abolished, Muhammad Ali will no longer be able to profit from trade through monopolies. Without the huge profits from these three monopolies, he will become a toothless tiger and will no longer be able to pose a threat to the Ottoman Empire. Mahmud I thought Palmerston's words made a lot of sense, but he felt that the British plan was not just that. At this time, Egypt was the greatest threat to the Ottoman Empire, so he still signed the agreement. Meanwhile, in the Magnolia Palace in Egypt, Ali was also meeting with his guests, an envoy from France. What does Prime Minister Thiers think of my proposal? Ali's voice held a hint of anticipation. His Excellency the Prime Minister said he would very much like to see the Egyptians achieve independence and looks forward to your further efforts. The French will be Egypt's most steadfast friend, the French envoy said. These words completely reassured him. With French support, even if the British sent troops to help the Ottomans, he was very confident of victory. The Russians had already signed a secret agreement with him. In fact, given the possibility, the Russians would certainly not miss the opportunity to partition the Ottoman Empire. At that time, the Ottoman Empire would become history, and he would lead Egypt to new hegemony. By this time, many countries had realized the impending changes in the Near East. After all, Muhammad Ali had not concealed his intention to lead Egypt to independence. Chapter 91 My Money. Otto, who had been closely monitoring the situation in the Near East, leaned back leisurely in his chair as Natasha read the newspaper to him as usual. In reality, Otto primarily obtained information through his own intelligence agency. The Royal Consortium had cooperative relationships with merchants and nobles in various countries, forming a tight network of connections. Through this semi-commercial, semi-intelligence network, a massive amount of intelligence was sent to Athens daily. Most of this intelligence was useless, only a very small fraction was truly valuable. The intelligence department would categorize and organize this information, identifying the useful pieces and sending them to Otto. This intelligence network was very extensive, but most of the intelligence sent was related to commerce. After all, merchants preferred to make money. At this moment, Natasha read an important piece of news that Otto already knew, and it was this news that led him to conclude that war between Egypt and the Ottoman Empire was imminent. Britain and the Ottoman Empire have signed a new economic agreement. According to the new agreement, the Sultanate's import tariffs will not exceed 5%, and export tariffs will not exceed 12%. At the same time, the Sultanate announced the abolition of the monopoly system within the Ottoman Empire, allowing foreign merchants to trade freely within Ottoman territory. Truly, the British are adept at manipulating things. They're taking advantage of Mahmud I's lack of economic knowledge, plotting to kill two birds with one stone. Upon seeing the contract, Otto knew that such low tariffs not only affected Egypt, but also deprived Mahmud I of his best weapon to protect the development of his domestic industry. Huh? Natasha was slightly taken aback, then saw Otto pat her thigh, gesturing for her to continue reading. Otto sometimes commented on important news, but most of the time he wouldn't explain in detail. She could only ponder it privately or ask him later. Natasha, puzzled, continued reading the newspaper, lost in thought. Otto knew a storm was brewing in the Near East, and he needed to consider how Greece could maximize its gains. Egypt's main sources of revenue currently rely on the export of cotton, tobacco, and indigo, as well as its control over the domestic sugar and salt trade. Losing its monopoly on these trades would cause Egypt's economy, or rather, its government's finances, to collapse. This is something Muhammad Ali would never allow. Otto is now curious about whether the Ottomans or Egypt will strike first. Historically, the Ottoman Empire has always been the first to intervene. It's uncertain whether this will change. Greece certainly won't let this opportunity to target the Ottoman Empire slip by, but the timing and extent of the attack require careful consideration. That damned bastard, what does he want? I'll declare independence right now and destroy Mahmud I and his toy soldiers. Upon hearing the agreement in Magnolia Palace, Muhammad Ali roared in fury. But we're not ready yet, his eldest son, Ibrahim, reminded him. Mahmud I is trying to destroy Egypt. I can't let him succeed. Muhammad Ali continued to shout. Great Ali, we can declare our refusal to recognize this agreement and cease all tribute to the Ottoman Empire, the foreign minister said. Egypt is already independent, Mahmud I's orders have no effect on us. That's right, Ibrahim said solemnly. As long as we don't recognize this agreement, Egypt's economy won't be affected. Once we're ready, defeating the Ottomans will be a piece of cake. In the last war, if the great powers hadn't sided with the Ottomans, we would have already captured Istanbul. Mahmud I's weak army couldn't have stopped the great Egyptian army. That's right, great Egypt will grow stronger and stronger, while the Ottoman Empire and Britain will only grow weaker and weaker. Once my ships are built, I won't have to fear the British threats anymore. After a moment of silence, Muhammad Ali said, this time, the French and Russians support us, and my fleet will soon be completed. At that time, even the British will not be able to stop me from becoming the only sultan in the world. Immediately declare that Egypt does not accept the Ottoman laws, and arrest all foreign merchants who dare to operate in Egypt without authorization, knock out their teeth, and burn their beards. Your Majesty, there's news from the Congo colony. The head steward, West, came to the Athens palace at noon that day and handed a report to Otto. Otto took the intelligence report, read it through, and then sneered. The Portuguese actually dare to play such petty tricks. The report stated that the Portuguese were selling musket ammunition to indigenous tribes near the Congolese colony and had even sent people to instruct these tribes on how to use the muskets. Most of the indigenous people trading with the Portuguese were tribes that had originally inhabited those lands during Otto's enclosure movement. Because Otto's designated area was too vast, the core settlements of the Congolese colony were relatively scattered, putting the garrison guards under strain. This military strain meant that the Congolese colony was unable to completely eliminate all the surrounding indigenous tribes immediately. It could only expel those around the core settlements. Most of these expelled indigenous tribes harbored hatred for the Congolese colony. Some, terrified, fled deeper into the interior and the Congolese rainforest, while others, unwilling to leave, sought opportunities outside the colony's patrol areas. The guards were unable to completely eliminate these people in a short time. The Portuguese, having likely realized this, chose to trade with these tribes, exchanging weapons and ammunition for considerable amounts of ivory and slaves from the natives. The Portuguese probably know they can't confront us directly, so they keep using these methods to cause us trouble, West said. This is an old trick of the Portuguese. After all, they've been operating in Central and Southern Africa for centuries, and most of the indigenous tribes in their Angolan colony have some connection with them. By trading with the Angolan natives and those tribes that are hostile to us, they prevent us from finding any fault with them. How much of an impact will this have on the Congo colony? Otto asked. The Portuguese sold outdated matchlock muskets to those indigenous tribes, and they were mostly second-hand, years old, of questionable quality. Their range and power were inferior to our Type 37 rifles, and these natives didn't know how to use them. For now, they're not a major concern, West said. But Portugal's actions have emboldened some of the indigenous tribes, making it even more difficult for us to drive them away. After a moment's thought, Otto said, have the colonies increase their vigilance. Send another regiment of the guards to the Congo colony, and expand the guards to 3 divisions. But this would put too much financial strain on us, West said in a deep voice. The royal family's cash flow is already dangerously low, and given the current situation, there's absolutely no need to send so many troops to the colonies. Expanding the army is necessary, and those parasites need to be purged. Otto sneered, have the intelligence personnel prepare to arrest and hang them all, They're embezzling my money. Chapter 92, Flipping the Table. In recent years, as the royal conglomerate has expanded rapidly, it has naturally produced some employees who have been enriching themselves at the expense of the company. Previously, in order to maintain the company's development, it was only temporarily to avoid internal turmoil within the royal conglomerate. Now that it is short of money, it is only natural to clean up the mess. Otto called in the intelligence chief and gave them instructions, telling them to do it immediately. Otto then informed Prime Minister Sanos and convened a cabinet meeting in the afternoon, explaining what had happened in the colony. "Does Your Majesty intend to declare war on Portugal?" Prime Minister Sanos asked after a moment's thought. Normally, matters concerning the colonies didn't require notification to the cabinet, because according to the initial agreement, Otto himself would bear the funding for the colonies' development, and the colonies were royal territories, beyond the cabinet's jurisdiction. Otto's bringing up colonial affairs now was naturally because it involved Portugal and could potentially trigger war between the two countries. It's not a declaration of war, but merely sending a diplomatic note to Portugal, ordering them to cease their support for the natives. At the same time, I also intend to expand the Imperial Guard to 3 divisions and the government army to 2 divisions, Otto explained. What? No way. Prime Minister Sanos was the first to object. Your Majesty, since last year, our Greek army has been expanding repeatedly. Now, including the guards, the Greek army exceeds 70,000 men, and the navy has reached 10,000, with 13 new steam-powered warships. This force far exceeds Greece's needs. Expanding the army now will only cause huge military expenditures to drag down Greece's economic development and become a burden on Greece. I remember that according to the latest government report, we will have a certain fiscal surplus starting next year, Otto said. But the cabinet has already planned to invest these funds in the development of the colonies, and Your Majesty has already agreed to it, the finance minister said, stepping forward. Greece's current development plan focuses on economic construction, while also increasing investment in education, healthcare, shipbuilding, and other sectors, encompassing 130 projects of varying sizes. The main focus is on road construction. Railways will connect most of the country's towns, and highway construction aims to reach every small town and even every village with a population exceeding 200. Steel mills will also expand production again, reaching an annual output of 51,000 tons of refined steel and 114,000 tons of pig iron within 5 years. The military factories will also introduce new equipment and add heavy artillery production lines. In addition to these infrastructure and industrial developments, Greece prioritizes technical training schools, encouraging secondary school graduates who fail to gain university admission to vocational schools to learn technical skills. In the medical field, the focus is on increasing training for healthcare personnel, encouraging experienced doctors to mentor apprentices, and providing subsidies. Greece also regularly organizes public health awareness campaigns to improve hygiene and prevent disease. While Greece announced the launch of its new 5-year plan in January 1838, the timing of many projects varied, with some even starting as early as the previous year. Because of the success of the previous 5-year plan, the second 5-year plan received tremendous attention domestically, sparking much discussion among Greeks, with different sectors focusing on different aspects. For example, railway workers were more concerned with further railway construction, as it concerned their future livelihoods. Capitalists were more focused on the new economic policies, in which the government planned to increase investment, thereby seeking future investment directions. The entire nation of Greece became busy as the plan unfolded. However, in reality, the total investment in the new 5-year plan was less than that of the previous 5 years, while the Greek government's revenue was more than double. This meant that the government did not need to issue bonds to implement the second 5-year plan, and could also have a small fiscal surplus in the later stages of the plan to invest in the colonies. This was something that had been agreed upon, but Otto wanted the government to expand the army. Was he planning to back out? Almost all the cabinet ministers thought that Otto had changed his mind, wanted to continue to monopolize the interests of the colonies, and was unwilling to bear the national defense costs anymore, thus requiring the government to expand the army by deploying the Imperial Guard to the colonies. Having been king for so many years, Otto's political acumen had also been constantly improving, and he naturally saw through the minister's thoughts. While amused, Otto had no choice but to offer an explanation. He took out a newspaper, pointed to a report, and said, regarding the recent commercial agreement signed between Britain and the Ottoman Empire, "What are your thoughts?" The cabinet ministers were initially taken aback. Weren't they talking about military expansion and spending? How did the conversation suddenly veer towards the British-Ottoman commercial agreement? Some ministers struggled to grasp Otto's erratic thinking, while Otto simply continued to look at them. The cabinet members present were all astute. After a moment, they gradually understood and looked at the map hanging on the wall next to the meeting room. Your Majesty means the war between the Ottoman Empire and Egypt? Prime Minister Sanos tentatively asked, glancing at the other ministers. No one can predict what the future holds, but our colonies are currently under threat, and I think we need to respond. Besides expanding our army, we also need to stockpile more war supplies. Otto patted the newspaper in his hand meaningfully, saying, personally, I don't want a conflict with the Portuguese. After all, it's just a small conflict in the colonies. If the Portuguese really had the guts, they wouldn't resort to such petty tricks. But we still need to prepare for it, especially by intensifying the training of our troops. Perhaps once the new troops are trained, they will be needed for war. What preparations for Portugal? With Greece's current strength, what preparations do we need to deal with the Portuguese? Many ministers inwardly cursed, but they all understood the implication and spoke with righteous indignation. That's right, our current focus in Greece is on expanding our colonies. The development of our colonies in Central and Southern Africa is crucial for Greece's future, so we cannot allow the Portuguese to act recklessly. We need to warn the Portuguese, and at the same time expand our army, ready to send troops to the Congo colony at any time. Portugal is no longer the colonial empire it once was, yet they dare to provoke us. We cannot tolerate this. On November 23, 1838, the Portuguese received a diplomatic note from Greece, along with a stern letter of rebuke written by Otto himself, and couldn't help but curse inwardly. Isn't it standard practice for everyone to secretly resort to underhanded tactics and create trouble? It's common for European countries to stab each other in the back behind the scenes, and Greece has been secretly expanding its colonial outposts in Angola as well. We were all tacitly competing behind the scenes, so what are you doing now? Are you planning to overturn the table and start a colonial war? Why don't you Greeks follow the rules? Are you a modern civilized nation or just reckless brutes? Chapter 93 The British Reaction. Greece's decision to expand its military, and the Greeks' reaction, greatly alarmed the Portuguese. Such a large-scale expansion could not be concealed. The Greek public, and even foreign workers, sensed something amiss. Many had received propaganda and even considered enlisting. Military service facilitated citizenship and offered better benefits. Speculation arose throughout Greece that war was imminent, and public discussion was rife. It looks like war is brewing, otherwise why would they need so many troops? I think so too. The newspapers say we've had a conflict with Portugal in the colonies. It looks like we're most likely going to war with Portugal. That's right, the colonies have brought back a lot of good stuff this year. I heard that the government was able to implement the work for relief program thanks to the grain brought in from the colonies. The colonies are so important, it's normal to fight Portugal for them. If we're just fighting the Portuguese, why would we need to expand our army? I think it's mostly the Ottoman Empire. The government must be planning to rescue our compatriots in Macedonia. I don't think so. The government has been prohibiting the publicity of the conflict with the Ottomans for the past few years. It's impossible for them to suddenly start a war against the Ottomans. Exactly. I don't know what His Majesty the King is thinking. What's so great about fighting the Portuguese? We should attack the Ottoman Empire and rescue our compatriots still under Ottoman brutal rule. Most Greeks were relatively calm about the impending war, even somewhat expectant and eager, showing no signs of aversion. This was actually related to the traditions of the Balkans. The Balkan Peninsula, located at the crossroads of Middle Eastern Europe, has always been a strategically important region coveted by powerful nations. Wars have been frequent throughout history, with Greek city-states, Macedonians, and Persians often clashing in ancient times. From the 2nd century BC, the Balkan Peninsula was successively ruled by the Roman, Byzantine, Avar, and Ottoman Turkish empires. Later, the Huns, Avars, Lombards, Romans, and then the Ottomans all waged wars or conscripted soldiers in this region. The frequent warfare throughout history fostered an accustomed attitude towards conflict among the people. While pure-blooded ethnic groups no longer exist in the Balkans, the spirit of war persists to this day. Seeing the growing anti-Greek sentiment in Greece, Portugal was even more alarmed. After establishing their colony in Congo, they diligently gathered information about Greece. Currently, Greece's army and navy are far stronger than Portugal's. Although Portugal has consistently emphasized a Greek threat and attempted to strengthen its military, its turbulent internal affairs, and crucially, its perennial fiscal deficits, mean Portugal simply cannot afford to equip its army with new gear, especially its navy, which lacks the funds to purchase new warships. Portugal can only watch helplessly as Greece's navy continues to expand. War is out of the question. Understanding Greece's strength, Portugal knows that in the event of conflict, the Greek navy could likely bombard Lisbon directly, and the Angolan colony would be no match for the troops stationed in the Quengalese colony. But the Greeks were being aggressive, so the Portuguese could only deal with them cautiously while seeking help from their superior. The Portuguese superior was naturally the British, who, since the Napoleonic Wars, had become Britain's subservient ally. It was only by clinging to Britain that Portugal managed to maintain the stability of its colonies after Brazil's independence, preventing them from being swallowed up by other countries, mainly Spain. Faced with a Portuguese request, there was some discussion within Britain. It seems the Greeks are planning to seek colonial expansion in Central and Southern Africa, but their reaction is far too strong, said Viscount Melbourne, reviewing the latest intelligence. Indeed, according to our intelligence, in the last 3 years, the Greeks have not only established colonies in the Congo River Basin, but have also recently established new colonial outposts in East Africa. Now, taking advantage of this year's natural disasters, they are constantly absorbing refugees from the German region and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies to expand their colonies. As for the overreaction, is Your Excellency worried about the Greeks' true intentions? Palmerston said. That's right, Viscount Melbourne said. While the Greeks seem to have some success with farming in Central and Southern Africa, they don't need to expand their army so much if it's just a colonial war. I worry that the Greeks' real aim is in the Balkans. The British weren't too concerned about Greek colonial expansion. Central and Southern Africa was considered unsuitable land by the British, and even if farming yielded some results, it wasn't of much value to them. Britain had too many colonies, many of which were suitable for cultivation, but Britain simply didn't have enough people to develop them. The British didn't care about the profits from the Central and Southern African colonies, otherwise, they wouldn't have allowed Portugal to hold the colonies of Angola and Mozambique for so long. The British had been watching Greece's military build-up closely. Now, in their eyes, the Greek army had exceeded acceptable limits, yet the Greeks still planned to expand further. The British also knew that dealing with the Portuguese didn't require such a large army, so Viscount Melbourne suspected the Greeks might have some inappropriate intentions. In any case, everyone was intelligent. Viscount Melbourne had a hunch about Otto's true intentions, though he wasn't entirely certain. Palmerston pondered this for a moment and said, the Greeks are likely aware of the situation in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt, and therefore want to take advantage of the chaos. As for the Portuguese, perhaps it's more of a warning. That's quite possible. If the Greeks really think that way, then what attitude do you think we should take towards them? Viscount Melbourne asked. Palmerston frowned. There's always been aspiration for a greater Greece within Greece, and King Otto is a very shrewd fellow. He saw that Egypt and the Ottomans were about to go to war and definitely wanted a share of the spoils. If we try to stop it now, it could very well lead Greece to completely side with the Russians. But we must not allow anyone to undermine the stability of the Balkans, Viscount Melbourne emphasized. I'm thinking, could we get the Greeks and the Ottoman Empire to join forces? Palmerston said. Currently, Crete is under Egyptian control. When the Greeks gained independence, Crete also experienced an uprising in support of the Greeks, but it was suppressed. Furthermore, some Greeks have settled in areas like Syria, which are under Egyptian control. I think Mahmud I wouldn't mind using Egyptian-controlled land as a bargaining chip. You mean, let the Greeks and the Ottomans work together against Egypt? Viscount Melbourne also began to ponder this. Palmerston continued, Muhammad Ali is a very ambitious man. His army has always been trained with the help of the French. It won't be easy for the Ottomans to defeat Egypt on their own. Now that war is imminent between the two countries as we predicted, we need to ensure that the war develops in the direction we desire. It seems you need to go to Athens, said Viscount Melbourne. Chapter 94 Otto's Proposal. Front Rabin was an ordinary Bavarian farmer who worked hard to feed his family. But this year's drought caused many seedlings to wither, jeopardizing the harvest. He could only pray daily in church, begging God to send rain, even though he didn't know how much of the crops would be saved. Then came the rainy season, and the rains arrived as expected. But before anyone could celebrate, the promised rain turned into disaster. The relentless torrential rains eventually created floods and flash floods, destroying everything on Earth. Houses, trees, fields, and livestock were all swept away. He was left with nothing and had to flee with his family. However, Bavarian officials stated that the government also had very little food, and the small amount lent to the disaster victims couldn't even guarantee they wouldn't starve. The countless human and animal carcasses left uncollected after the disaster led to an outbreak of plague. Even church priests died of the disease. Franz had no choice but to bring his family to Munich to beg. The citizens were not welcoming to refugees, but fortunately, news arrived that the second son of Emperor Ludwig I was recruiting refugees to work in the African colonies. Franz had heard that Africa was a wasteland rife with disease, but he had no other choice but to register with his family and follow the staff to the port of Luxembourg, boarding an immigrant ship bound for the colonies. The immigrant ships were designed to transport more immigrants, so the living quarters were cramped. Fortunately, his family of 4 was allocated a small room on the ground floor. After what seemed like countless days, they finally reached the port. The Ford family, along with other immigrants, were disembarked and taken to a temporary settlement by staff. The immigrants were given a bath by the staff and then taken to the communal dining hall, where they were given a rare, hearty meal. Next, a doctor examined them to ensure no one was sick before they were divided into groups and, under the protection of soldiers, traveled a long distance to the designated farm at the colonial settlement. There, Ford was assigned to plant cotton, while his wife was assigned to sew clothing for the farm workers. Life here seemed much better than he had imagined, and Franz couldn't help but thank Prince Otto. The reason Franz decided to come to the African colony, besides the dire circumstances, was largely due to Prince Otto's good reputation in Bavaria. Farm work on Prince Otto's lands was a coveted job for Bavarian farmers. Working for him guaranteed a full stomach and no taxes to worry about. Agricultural taxes were collected centrally by the farms, with no exorbitant levies. While the wages weren't high, they were a minor issue as long as food was plentiful. Working on the colonial farm was the same. All the workers received the same fresh food. The only thing he found difficult to adjust to was the strict hygiene regulations. The farm mandated that farmhands shower regularly and use designated toilets. Their dormitories were also subject to regular hygiene inspections. Failure to meet standards resulted in point deductions, affecting the monthly squad evaluation. Fortunately, aside from these regulations, life in the colony wasn't much different from back home, except it was hotter and made sweating more frequent. Ford had already gotten used to life there. In his spare time, he could attend classes at the farm school, learning Greek from the teachers and pastors. However, what truly interested him were the various anecdotes he heard at school, adding a touch of fun to their otherwise monotonous lives. Ludwig I actually welcomed Otto's recruitment of refugees within his territory, knowing they would bring trouble, a problem he had faced frequently since becoming king. The Bavarian kingdom had low revenue, a corrupt and extravagant upper class, and rampant corruption. When Ludwig I first became king of Bavaria, he had some ambitions, but soon found himself doing things in vain. Therefore, like most monarchs of the time, he began pursuing things that interested him, such as beautiful women and art. Thanks to a new temporary relief bill that sent disaster victims to African colonies, the refugees who'd have gathered in Munich gradually left, and the city quickly recovered, as if unaffected by the food crisis. The streets remained bustling, and the itinerant artists still gathered in Munich's parks. Some painted portraits, some performed acrobatics, and some played musical instruments, striving for their ideals. Ludwig I built simple houses nearby for these itinerant artists to live in. Of course, it wasn't a free-for-all. To live there, one had to prove talent, such as painting a picture, singing a song, or playing a piece of music. Sometimes Ludwig I would give them opportunities to showcase their talents, allowing them to perform. Although the pay was meager, outstanding performances would earn them substantial rewards. The resolution of the refugee problem brought Ludwig I a sigh of relief, and he returned to his previous life. However, what he didn't expect was that at this time, the Prime Minister proposed the idea of developing colonies to him. Perhaps seeing Otto's success in developing colonies in Central and Southern Africa, the Bavarian cabinet thought colonization seemed like a lucrative business, otherwise, Otto wouldn't have invested so much. However, Bavaria had no experience in colonization, so the cabinet members approached Ludwig I, hoping he could help contact Otto and provide assistance in this endeavor. Ludwig I actually knew far more about Otto's colonization of Central and Southern Africa than the cabinet. He knew that Otto had invested a considerable amount of money and hadn't yet recouped his investment. Given Bavaria's financial situation, it simply didn't have the capital to develop colonies. Therefore, he directly rejected the cabinet's request, giving them time to consider colonies and instead focusing on governing the country first. If Otto hadn't taken in a large number of refugees, the cabinet would likely be in a state of chaos. However, to Ludwig I's surprise, Otto then offered a suggestion, a proposal that would allow Bavaria to acquire new territory in Central America. In Ludwig I's eyes, Central America was nothing but a barren wasteland, but Otto stated in his letter that given the current situation in Europe, seeking expansion there was extremely difficult. In contrast, Central America was rich in resources and had a certain foundation. The Spanish had developed it for centuries, and although now considered a barren land, it held great potential. The current upheaval in Central America makes it entirely possible to have Otto's elder brother, Maximilian, become king. This would allow the two countries to unite into a single, powerful nation upon Maximilian's ascension. With Bavaria's growing strength, it might even be able to compete with Austria and Prussia for dominance in the German region. Even if other nations are unwilling to have the elder brother as king, they could choose Otto's younger brother, Luitpold, adding another crown to their family's roster. It would be beneficial either way. Otto's final statement about the German region resonated with Ludwig I's concerns, prompting him to intend to have a serious discussion with Otto. Chapter 95 King of the Central American Federation. A simple letter couldn't explain many things in detail, so Ludwig I invited Otto back to Munich for Christmas in 1838 and took the opportunity to inquire about Central America. At that time, Central America was still occupied by the Federation of Central America, which consisted of 5 regions: Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. In earlier years, Central America and Mexico were both Spanish colonies. In 1821, Mexican rebels captured Mexico City and declared Mexican independence. Central America also declared its independence from Spanish rule and joined Mexico. However, less than 2 years later, after Iturbide, who proclaimed himself Emperor of Mexico, abdicated, the Mexican Civil War broke out. The Federation of Central Americans, seemingly sensing the unreliability of the Mexicans, decisively convened a national constitutional conference, once again declaring independence and establishing the United Central American Province, with its capital in Guatemala City. The rebellion that erupted in the Federation at this time was entirely due to a series of unpopular policies implemented by the then-President, Lamassin. Lamassin greatly admired Napoleon and strictly enforced Napoleonic code in Central America, even establishing the St. Cyr Military Academy in his style. However, because Central America had previously been a Spanish colony, very few people were educated, and the populace was largely unfamiliar with these complex laws. As a result, the number of people waiting to be executed in the marketplaces exceeded the number of ordinary citizens. At this time in Central America, Catholicism wielded immense influence and wealth. Lamassin, disregarding strategy, directly abolished tithes and confiscated church property. He then exiled missionaries, ordered the forced demolition of monasteries, and forced the nuns to return to secular life. Simultaneously, sharing the same ambition as Emperor Yang of Sui, he planned the construction of the Nicaragua Grand Canal, forcibly conscripting indigenous people, which led to a rebellion by local conservatives and indigenous groups. When the army was sent to quell the rebellion, Lamassin, lacking military expertise, insisted on personally leading the troops, resulting in repeated defeats for the government forces and the rebellion growing stronger. Initially, the rebels consisted of only a few thousand indigenous people, armed with spears and clubs, yet they fought a stalemate against Lamassin's 20,000-strong army. A year later, the rebels had almost completely occupied Guatemala, while Lamassin had no troops left to deploy. Because Lamassin's policies were unpopular, the Central American Federation declared independence one after another, leaving Lamassin isolated and Central America in chaos. Mexico initially wanted to take advantage of the chaos, but having just quelled its own internal unrest, it dared not act further after being warned by Britain and France. The Americans joined in by reiterating the Monroe Doctrine, but no one paid any attention. The Central American Federation is dominated by conservatives, but President Mauricio insists on pursuing liberalism. Crucially, his methods are extremely harsh, alienating virtually every domestic power. Currently, Only the president of Nicaragua is willing to support him, making him a veritable pair of rivals with Juan Carlos of Spain. Upon arriving in Munich, Otto briefed Ludwig I and Maximilian on the situation in the Central American Federation, saying, "In my opinion, a backward region like the Central American Federation, with its strong conservative forces, is more suitable for autocratic rule. If we intervene now, we will gain the support of the local churches and conservatives. But is the Central American Federation really worth all our effort?" Maximilian frowned. He wasn't really interested in becoming king in Central America. In his view, he was content to wait here to inherit the Kingdom of Bavaria. Now, to become king in this barbaric land of Central America would surely be ridiculed by the nobles. Otto said, "Don't be fooled by the fact that the Central American Federation is currently underdeveloped. It is rich in resources, including silver, gold, lead, zinc, copper, iron, antimony, and coal. Furthermore, the land is ideal for agriculture, so its potential is enormous." Indeed, Ludwig I said, the Spanish discovered many silver mines in Central America. In terms of natural conditions, the Central American Federation's land and resources are even better than Bavaria's. However, developing it will likely be difficult, and many countries would prefer to see a fragmented Central America. "There's no need to worry about that," Ludwig I replied. "The French are currently focusing their efforts on North America. France, the United States, and Mexico are mutually restraining each other, and no one has the energy to deal with Central America. Britain is currently preoccupied with the situation in the Near East, and crucially, the churches in the Central American Federation are seeking help everywhere, giving us an excellent opportunity to intervene." Otto said confidently, "Recently, the war in the Central American Federation has escalated into a massacre of local whites. The white population in Guatemala has already decreased by 30%. Both the church and the local whites hope for a leader who can quickly quell this conflict." Speaking of the massacre of whites, it was the church that shot itself in the foot. Due to constant pressure from Morazan, when a plague broke out in Guatemala, the church claimed that Morazan had poisoned the water. This resulted in a large number of revolting natives targeting whites and all privileged classes. Although the church narrowly escaped the massacre, its members, mostly white, felt utterly insecure. Sure enough, not long after, massacres and looting targeting missionaries occurred in some areas, further unsettling the church. Local churches contacted Europe for solutions, which led Otto to focus his attention on Central America, a region not originally in his plans. If the Near East crisis hadn't been so imminent, Otto would have preferred to intervene personally, but now he could only benefit his own people. However, judging from his brother's appearance, he seemed reluctant, completely incapable of any real action. Sighing inwardly, Otto continued, "Right now, both liberals and conservatives want to restore order as quickly as possible, but extreme liberals like Morazan clearly can't do it. He'll only make things worse. The locals need someone with sufficient prestige to step forward and take charge. At this time, we only need to contact the local forces, and I believe we can easily gain a lot of support, take the opportunity to negotiate terms, and seize some real power. As for the local rebellion, it's just some untrained Indians. And the weapons they possess are all old relics from the Spanish colonial era. A well-trained army can easily quell it. The Central American Federation is a legacy of the Spanish colonial empire, where conservative forces are strong and localism is rampant. If Maximilian successfully becomes the king of the Central American Federation, as an outsider, he will initially have to share many rights with local powers. Central America, while not large in area, is strategically important and rich in resources, though largely undeveloped, relying mainly on the export of crops such as maize, sugarcane, cocoa, and tobacco. Otto believes that as long as Maximilian doesn't recklessly implement new policies, doesn't immediately threaten the main interests of local powers, quietly develops himself, understands the situation, and gathers supporters, it won't be difficult. Once Otto is free to act, Bavaria and Greece can easily eliminate opponents and seize real power by jointly sending troops. Then, we can recruit some immigrants from the German region. With the potential of the Central American Federation, it will definitely have a brighter future than the Kingdom of Bavaria. With the Central American Federation, the Kingdom of Bavaria will not be so easily annexed by Prussia. Even if the situation becomes irreversible, the Central American Federation can serve as a fallback plan. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 96: The Arrival of the British. After a full afternoon of discussion, Ludwig I finally decided to contact the local Catholic Church to gauge the local people's thoughts through them. Otto also offered some advice on how to win over the locals, quell the current rebellion, and what policies to implement. After spending another Christmas in Munich, Otto returned to Athens on January 5, 1839. He had originally planned to stay longer to observe the immigration situation in the German region firsthand, but news of the upcoming visit of the British ambassador, Palmerston, forced him to change his itinerary and return to Greece early to meet with the British Foreign Secretary. Your Majesty Otto, I've heard that you and Portugal have had some unpleasantness recently, Palmerston said bluntly after a few simple greetings. Otto, prepared for the British questions, said, "The Portuguese have caused great trouble for the Quengalese colony by selling weapons and equipment to the local natives. I have reason to believe they harbor ill intentions towards Greece. They are just some local natives who don't even know how to load ammunition. They shouldn't be enough to cause any trouble," Palmerston said. "But your Majesty, your reaction seems a bit excessive. The act of being hostile to the Greeks must be punished, otherwise the Portuguese will become even more emboldened," Otto insisted. "Britain is a peace-loving country and doesn't want unrest in Africa. Besides, Greece's reaction has been a bit too much. Moreover, if it were just a small conflict between two countries' colonies, it doesn't seem necessary to expand the army so much," Palmerston said pointedly. "I knew it," Otto thought with a sinking feeling. He never expected everyone else to be stupid, but the British reaction was faster than he had anticipated. Seeing that Otto remained silent, Palmerston continued, "As far as I know, there has always been a call within Greece to expand its territory and restore the so-called Greater Greece. This is just the talk of a few radicals in the public. The Greek government has never considered it." Otto chose to play dumb. Palmerston pressed on, saying, "But Greece's excessive expansion of its military will cause instability in the Near East. Britain does not want the stability of the Near East to be affected, and anyone who tries to change the balance of power in the Near East will be an enemy of Britain." "Greece has no intention of changing the balance in the Near East," Otto said. "Greece's focus is currently on its African colonies. We are currently busy developing our African colonies, and immigrant ships are already crowding the ports. How can we possibly have the energy to care about changes in the situation in the Near East? There are indeed countries attempting to disrupt peace in the Near East. The Egyptians are eyeing what doesn't belong to them. Britain, as a vital force for world peace, has been urging Muhammad Ali to calm down." Palmerston then suddenly added, "But if he ignores Britain's well-intentioned advice, Britain will certainly take action. I hope His Majesty Otto will stand with Britain then. The Near East has always been a region of great international concern. Greece is merely a small country with no power to intervene. We will maintain a strictly neutral stance," Otto said. "As a country on the Balkan Peninsula, and with this happening right on Greece's doorstep, it's hard for Greece to remain uninvolved," Palmerston said. "Britain won't forget its allies either. Those countries that disrupt peace must be punished. The people in many areas under Egyptian rule are also extremely dissatisfied with Muhammad Ali's brutality, and I think they would be willing to support a benevolent king." Otto immediately understood Palmerston's intention. Britain was using Egypt's current territory as bait. Crete was among the territories Greece had always wanted to reclaim, and it was currently under Egyptian rule. Otto, realizing the British had discerned his ulterior motives in expanding his army, initially assumed Palmerston had come to warn him. He hadn't expected the British to directly use Egyptian interests to win him over. "So, what should I do next? Continue with my original strategy, or see what price the British offer and then consider cooperating with them?" Otto pondered, unable to make a decision. He said, "Greece has no intention of intervening in the Near East, but will firmly safeguard its own interests." Palmerston was satisfied with Otto's seemingly unsubstantial answer, knowing Otto was definitely tempted, but both sides were still in a probing phase and wouldn't make a decision easily. Palmerston was a confident, even arrogant, man. He believed that Greece would certainly side with Britain if there were profits to be made. Recently, Greece's military strength had expanded rapidly. If Britain could persuade the Greeks, it would be easier for the British to deal with Egypt. Britain did not want to see an increasingly powerful Egypt and also coveted Egyptian cotton. That's why it encouraged the Ottoman Empire to invade Egypt. Now that Greece had joined the fray, the British would have even more control. If they defeated Egypt this time, Britain could then intervene in Egyptian affairs, especially controlling Egyptian cotton cultivation and providing cheap raw materials for the British textile industry. As for the colonial conflicts between Greece and Portugal, Britain wasn't actually very concerned, and even welcomed them, as the contradictions between the two sides were more beneficial to the British. However, at this time, Britain did not want Greece and Portugal to go to war over the colonies, so Palmerston continued, as for the conflict between Greece and Portugal over the African colonies, I hope that the two countries can prioritize peace and sit down for a proper talk. Greece has always tried to resolve the colonial issues with Portugal through diplomacy, provided that Greece's interests in Central and Southern Africa are respected. Otto said without hesitation that he originally had no intention of going to war with Portugal in the colonies, but merely wanted to divert the attention of other countries. Now that the topic of colonies in Central and Southern Africa had come up, Otto seized the opportunity to make a request. Namibia? That's not a good place. Many countries have tried to colonize it, first the Dutch, then the Spanish and Portuguese. But the land is barren, the natives are wild and warlike, and difficult to tame. Even we abandoned our last foothold there more than a decade ago. Is Greece also interested? Palmerston hadn't expected Otto to propose establishing a colonial outpost in Namibia, hoping to get the British's approval, since Namibia wasn't far from the British Cape Colony. Palmerston had some understanding of Namibia, a place explorers called the Gates of Hell, a piece of land with little value. Why did the Greeks always seem to focus on such worthless rotten land? Seeing Palmerston's surprise, Otto guessed what he was thinking and said, Greece is a weak country, so when choosing to develop colonies, it naturally only chooses lands that others don't want. Recently, we established a new colonial outpost in the inland region of East Africa. I want to build several ports in Namibia as docking points for immigrant ships heading to East Africa. Chapter 97 Land Enclosure Progress. The environment in Namibia at that time was harsh, even the coastal areas were covered by desert, making it unsuitable for colonization. Furthermore, the local indigenous tribes were generally fierce and warlike, leading to its abandonment by the colonists. Otto knew that the highlands in eastern Namibia offered a much better environment, but its distance from the coast meant virtually no explorers could venture there. Because the coastal areas were all desert, establishing settlements there would face shortages of food, water, fuel, and even building materials. In addition, Namibia lacked deep water ports. Only the port of Wallace was somewhat suitable, where fewer than 200 white people gathered as a transit point for passing merchant ships, but it was frequently attacked by the natives. What people don't know now is that the Namibian coast was later known as the Diamond Coast, rich in high-quality diamonds. Of course, at that time, these veins were located in a barren desert. To truly colonize Namibia and establish a foothold, it was necessary to first occupy the eastern plateau and then find a way to develop its resources. As for the local indigenous people, they were divided into more than 10 countries, hundreds of tribes, and dozens of languages, including the Ovambo, Herero, and Mana people, but their total population did not exceed 50,000. Dealing with them was not particularly difficult. The real challenge was the local environment. Otto's current plan is to first establish a port transit point here, then seek opportunities to explore inland, understand the local geography, and then send immigrants to the inland highlands to establish a foothold. The British had abandoned their colonization of Namibia more than a decade ago, but still held ownership of the port of Woolwich. Otto wants to buy the port from the British, while simultaneously getting their tacit approval for Greece to establish a colony there. After all, Britain is different from Portugal. Greece can use some threatening measures against Portugal, but facing the mighty British Empire, Greece is no match and can only take advantage of information asymmetry to stealthily gain control. Palmerston considered Otto's proposal a minor matter, but still decided to confirm the information with the colonial department and let them decide. For farmers in Europe, the large farms established by the Otto Agricultural Company held unparalleled appeal. Entering these farms meant no more worries about exorbitant taxes and levies. Furthermore, the farms had well-established rules and regulations. The more you worked, the more you earned, and the better you performed, the more generous the rewards. On the farms, food was not a concern. While wages weren't high, they provided for basic needs, allowing for sustenance. When necessary, one could even join the farm's entourage to the city to shop and experience a bit of wealth. The children of farm workers on large farms receive free primary education, and the workers and their families enjoy free basic medical care. Farms typically have their own chapels. The only drawback is the busy off-season, requiring strenuous military training organized by the farm. However, compared to their previous lives, it's a world of difference. The agricultural company's excellent reputation across various regions played a crucial role in the migration that began in the latter half of last year. Desperate, these farmers were more willing to trust those who treated them well. The staff, while perhaps embellishing the story to some extent, did not portray Africa as paradise. The staff's attitude earned the refugees' trust, and coupled with their established reputation, these desperate refugees ultimately chose to travel thousands of miles with the immigrant fleet, arriving in batches in the Central and Southern African colonies. Dodoma was one of the key colonial outposts established in the early Greek East African colonies, located roughly in the same area as the later capital of Tanzania. Situated at an altitude of over 1,100 meters, it maintained a very cool climate even in Central and Southern Africa, and its proximity to the upper reaches of the Wami River made its geographical location extremely important. From here, goods unloaded at the port of Sanran could be transshipped to other outposts, facilitating subsequent immigration. Before the rainy season, the colonial team cleared the ground around the outpost by setting fires, and then the immigrants began cultivating the land. The indigenous tribes in the vicinity were originally few in number and still in the hunter-gatherer stage. They had long been driven out or captured by the Imperial Guard. The area planned for the former Greek East African colony was over 90 square kilometers, so it was impossible to complete the immigration in just a few years. The large wave of immigrants from Europe last year and this year initially only occupied key strongholds, and then, using these strongholds as centers, continuously expanded until they finally gained complete control of the land. Otto still has plenty of time. First, he needs to secure the territory, and then, within the next 20 or 30 years, he will use various methods to send away the indigenous people within his sphere of influence. After that, there will naturally be no more racial issues. The integration of Chinese and white people was relatively easy, at least in Otto's opinion. The Chinese are inherently a very tolerant people, and integration wasn't difficult. Otto also consistently promoted the concept of cultural identity within his country. The Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and the South African Aborigine rebellion in later generations truly terrified Otto. He didn't believe he had the ability to solve this problem, so even if it required more effort, he dared not leave the local Aborigines behind. The immigrants who arrived wore relatively simple clothing, all in uniforms issued by the colonial team, and appeared to be in good condition. However, the colonial staff dared not relax. In the eyes of European explorers, Africa was a cursed continent due to the prevalence of tropical diseases. Colonists mostly stayed along the coast and were unwilling to venture inland. Under Otto's constant emphasis, the colonies in Central and Southern Africa placed great importance on sanitation, resulting in a series of regulations. For example, tap water had to be boiled before drinking, undercooked meat was forbidden, and snakes and frogs were strictly prohibited from consumption or frequent contact. Settlements were regularly disinfected, with a focus on preventing mosquito bites, and waste was collected and utilized properly. These were always the most important tasks for the colony administrators, especially the strict control over diet, as Otto was well aware of the proverb illness enters through the mouth. Food was still plentiful in Central and Southern Africa. The environment ensured sufficient food production. Even with recent over-immigration causing relative food shortages, there were still plenty of wild bananas and fruits available to sustain them. The large herbivores on the grasslands could be hunted, so although the large-scale immigration caused a slight shortage of food in the African colonies for a time, it was only a matter of not being able to eat their fill, and no one starved to death. Chapter 98 Russian Envoy 1839, at the port of New Nafplio, settled immigrants and colonial officials came together to receive goods. Unlike before, there were more people present today. I wonder why Master Gilman called us all here this time. Usually, so many people aren't needed, an immigrant asked. How should I know? Just do what we're told. Why think so much? A slightly older immigrant replied. I'm just worried because there's been a lot of immigrants lately, leading to food shortages. The daily food supply has been reduced. Judging by this situation, could it be another group of new immigrants? Don't overthink it. You know how fertile our land is. We even planted extra crops this year. The problem will be solved in a few months at most. There's so much land here, those new immigrants can't possibly take up our space. Besides, those natives are clumsy and can't even farm properly. What are you worrying about? While the immigrants were discussing this, the ship docked at the port of New-Nafplio. The sailors opened the railings along the side of the ship and laid out wooden planks, creating a loading channel several meters wide. The colony officials began directing the immigrants to board the ships and unload the cargo. The immigrants soon saw their goods. Horses, sheep, and cattle, some of them exclaimed in surprise. I knew it. The colony officials must have figured it out. The land here is fertile, livestock are essential for better farming. The grass around our settlement grows so well, we can even establish ranches. Those natives don't know how to farm or raise livestock, no wonder they sent us to unload the cargo. After a flurry of activity, the immigrants finally managed to get all the livestock off the ships and then drove them towards the town of New-Nafplio. These livestock were all purchased by Otto from various parts of Europe. Eastern Europe, particularly Russia, is famous for its horses, so most of these horses came from there. The cattle and sheep came from the Netherlands, a major livestock-producing country, as animal husbandry is the leading industry in Dutch agriculture. Horse-drawn plows are prevalent in Europe, so the European immigrants were very familiar with using horses for farming, hence the larger number of horses brought this time. The cattle and sheep were mainly for raising. Currently, farming in Europe still relies heavily on livestock. While steam-powered agricultural machinery has appeared on the market, it is still relatively new, with high failure rates, high prices, large size, and low efficiency, resulting in virtually no market. Therefore, agriculture at this stage is still primarily based on livestock. Transporting these animals will provide power for the future and also support livestock farming. The indigenous people of Africa were hunter-gatherers and had no tradition of domesticating livestock. Abundant resources meant these tribes lacked the incentive to improve their productivity. Therefore, there were no domesticated large animals, resulting in wild and untamed wildlife. Otto had to import large numbers of livestock from Europe. Immigrants drove the cattle and horses to large farms on the outskirts of New-Nafplio. The immigrants began building fences as required and hired experienced settlers to manage the livestock. Some of the livestock were kept there, while most were distributed to nearby colonial outposts. The Central and Southern African colonies were now busy with immigration and expansion, and had no real capacity to wage a colonial war against Portugal. Their previous actions were merely smoke and mirrors. Clearly, the British were not fooled. Their experience shrewdly discerned that Greece's military expansion was truly a preparation for impending war in the Near East. Shortly after Palmerston's visit, the tensions between Greece and Portugal regarding the colonies eased considerably, and they quickly reached an agreement prohibiting the sale of weapons to the colonists, thus ending their dispute. However, the smell of gunpowder in the Near East grew increasingly strong, and the Russians, naturally, could not miss this opportunity to get involved. On January 25, 1839, a secret envoy from St. Petersburg arrived at the royal palace in Athens and met with King Otto. The Tsar's secret envoy, Abramovich, who appeared more like a soldier than a diplomat, went straight to the point upon meeting Otto. Your Majesty Otto, the opportunity to destroy the Ottoman Empire is at hand. I think Greece wouldn't want to miss this chance. Before Otto could speak, Abramovich continued, Egypt and the Ottoman Empire are about to go to war, and His Majesty the Tsar has already ordered the army to begin mobilization. If Greece joins in, it can seize Macedonia and Epirus from the Ottoman Empire. The Tsar's proposal is indeed tempting, he added, but Greece has a long coastline, we must consider the British attitude. Otto pondered for a moment and said, Greece cannot make a hasty decision while the situation remains unclear. Your Majesty Otto, Greece is about to miss its greatest opportunity. The goodwill of the Russian Empire is not easily bestowed, Abramovich said in a deep voice. Please rest assured, Your Majesty, I will carefully consider His Majesty's suggestion. Greece is not yet ready, we must give them time to consider. Faced with the other party's somewhat aggressive attitude, Otto remained unmoved and did not yield. In the end, Abramovich could only return to his residence with some anger, while Otto summoned all the cabinet members. Gentlemen, you are all aware of the general terms offered by the British and the Russians. Which side should we choose? Do you have any suggestions? After Otto finished speaking, the cabinet ministers began to ponder. Frankly speaking, whichever side they chose, success would expand Greece's existing territory. Relatively speaking, the Russian terms were more tempting. Compared to Crete and Egyptian-controlled Syria, Macedonia and Epirus were clearly more attractive. In particular, Macedonia was inhabited by a large Greek population, making it significantly more valuable than the vast deserts and numerous pagan populations of the Arabian Peninsula. The cabinet ministers discussed the matter for a while before gradually quieting down. Prime Minister Sano stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, in this upcoming war in the Near East, we believe the Russians have a greater chance of winning. When Egypt and the Ottoman Empire went to war, the Ottoman army was no match for the Egyptian army. Now, the Egyptians have the support of the French. French officers have been helping to train their troops. In contrast, the Ottomans rely on Prussian officers, and according to intelligence, only about half of their army is modernized. We highly doubt that Mahmud II and his army can defeat Egypt while being held back by Russia." The British Navy was indeed unmatched, but in wars in the Near East, the key lay on land. In the strength of the army. Even with British assistance, the Ottoman Empire struggled to withstand French-backed Egypt, let alone defeat the Tsar's army on land. Chapter 99 Otto's Plan. Clearly, compared to the Ottoman Empire, many cabinet ministers believed Russia would ultimately prevail. After all, the strength of the Russian army was well known, and no matter how powerful the British Navy was, it was impossible for them to send warships onto land. Under these circumstances, Sanos's inclination was self-evident. Greece needed to side with the victor to better share the spoils of victory. But we also need to consider the British reaction. The British fleet could blockade our ports at any time, which would severely damage our domestic economy, the Minister of Commerce and Industry said at this moment. The British warships certainly cannot sail ashore, but they are too close for us Greeks. If the British attack our ports, our navy may not be able to guarantee their safety. Are we just going to let this excellent opportunity slip by? General Courant, the Minister of Defense, couldn't help but ask. Of course not, but we must also be mindful of the British reaction. I think it would be more advantageous for us to sign a contract with the British. No matter how powerful the Russians are, they cannot possibly penetrate the Balkans. Not only the British, but the Austrian Empire would also be unwilling to watch the Russians occupy the Balkans. If Russia makes any move, they will certainly try to stop it. Although the benefits of allying with the British may be less, it would be much safer, the Minister of Commerce and Industry said. But even if it's Crete, Syria's environment is worse than the Balkans, and it's mostly Arabs with very few Greeks. It's simply not suitable for our rule. Soon everyone was arguing. The majority chose Russia, but some still believed that following the British was less risky. No one could convince anyone else, so Otto stopped the arguing ministers and said, "I have an idea. Perhaps we can set our sights on the entire Balkans." After hearing Otto's words, all the cabinet ministers were speechless. The entire Balkans? Otto's plan was far too ambitious, and equally reckless. One wrong move, and Greece could be doomed. Your Majesty, this is too dangerous. It completely offends both the British and the Russians. The Russians won't stand by and watch us gain the entire Balkan Peninsula. We'll face the wrath of both countries. It's not that exaggerated. I have some information here. The British have recently been in contact with the Polish Reconquista and have provided those Polish people with a batch of weapons and supplies. Otto revealed a piece of information he had obtained. This information actually came from the Polish Reconquista itself. Otto's support for the Polish Reconquista was covert, and he even used the names of both the British and the French. Perhaps in order to bargain and obtain better terms, the Polish Reconquista took the initiative to pass on this information, letting Otto know that the British were indeed preparing a backup plan. If the Polish launch an uprising at a crucial moment, the Russians will likely be unable to launch an attack on the Balkans for a short period of time. But in that case, we might as well ally with the British directly. It would be safer that way. The British won't allow us to do that. But if we really succeed, what do you think the British will do? Otto said. For the British, they just don't want the Russians to expand in the Near East. In my opinion, the corrupt Ottoman Empire is a hopeless case. The British only chose to support the Ottoman Empire out of desperation to contain the Russian Empire. If they had a better option, given the British's flexibility, they would definitely change their policy. As for Austria, their primary strategic target is now the German region, followed by the Italian region, and lastly the Balkans. With the right diplomatic means, it shouldn't be too difficult to get them to temporarily accept the status quo. This plan was something Otto had long harbored in his mind. Just as his ministers had advised, it was extremely risky, but if successful, Greece could escape its current state of being manipulated and completely dependent on the whims of the great powers. From the moment he became king of Greece, Otto had this plan in mind. Crucially, based on the current situation and the intelligence he had gathered, he was certain that the chances of success were still very high. This was almost a gamble with the fate of the nation. After the initial shock, the cabinet ministers pondered it carefully and realized that, as Otto had said, if successful, Greece would soar to new heights, becoming a pivotal nation in Central Europe. Thinking of this, everyone became excited, discussing the possibility of the plan's success and the strategies that should be adopted. Otto and his cabinet ministers discussed the matter late into the night, and even after returning home, many ministers were still unable to calm down. After resting with his servants, Thanos lay in bed, still thinking about the day's events. After a long period of contemplation, he finally sighed, "Our emperor is truly terrifying. He will either bring Greece to glory or drag it into hell." The Balkans have always been a sensitive region, and Greece's military expansion quickly caused turmoil in the surrounding areas. The Ottoman Empire took note of Greece's actions and received advice from the British envoy Palmerston. However, Mahmud I was unwilling to ally with the Greeks. Firstly, Greek independence had always been a thorn in his side. The Ottomans had been utterly overwhelmed in dealing with it, ultimately even turning against Egypt due to their failure. Secondly, Mahmud I held the Greeks in low regard, always considering their army to be nothing more than a disorganized mob. He believed that if it weren't for the subsequent assistance from Britain, France, and Russia, the Greek uprising would have been suppressed long ago. Now the Greeks were even trying to take advantage of the war between the Ottoman Empire and Egypt, but Mahmud I wouldn't give them the chance. Even if Greece dared to launch a war against the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman army stationed in Macedonia would make it clear to the Greeks that they were nothing but a clown, and their so-called Greater Hellenism was a colossal joke. Compared to Greece, the Ottoman Empire was more worried about the Russians, so Mahmud I ordered the troops stationed in the Principality of Moldavia to strengthen their vigilance, closely monitor Russian movements, and even sent a shipment of supplies there. As for Greece, despite Palmerston's repeated emphasis on the benefits of allying with the Greeks, Mahmud I rejected his proposal without hesitation. Mahmud I further stated that if the Greek ragtag army dared to invade the great Ottoman Empire, his army would march into Athens to show the Greeks that their independence was solely due to the Sultan's mercy. To this end, Ottoman ordered the Macedonian legion stationed in Skopje, Macedonia, to march south to Patara, thus deterring the Greeks from any rash actions. Chapter 100 Otto's all-in bet. After more than a week of discussions, Greece's latest strategy has finally been released, and various departments have begun working to implement it. As soon as Greece announced its military expansion, recruitment offices were packed with people, and the neatly arranged registration lines even stretched into the streets, demonstrating the enthusiasm of the Greeks. Of course, this was all official newspaper propaganda. The lines were indeed very long, but these were all designated reservists, meaning they were required to register according to government regulations. Although Greece is recruiting a large number of foreign workers for its military expansion, it actually operates on a conscription system. If it were a volunteer force, the finances would not be able to bear such a large expenditure. The government plans to expand the army to 3 divisions, with the guards also expanding to 3 divisions at the same time. Add to that artillery regiments and specialized engineers, and the Greek army will reach a record 14 divisions. If it weren't for the large number of foreign workers recruited, it's likely that Greece wouldn't have been able to find so many young men of suitable age. After all, Greece needs to maintain domestic production. Of its slightly over 1 million population, only about 60,000 are in the military. That's already the limit. If the number continues to increase, the conscription age will have to be relaxed. To prepare for the upcoming war, Greece needs to prepare a large sum of war funds, because everyone knows that war costs money. Fortunately, Otto had always paid close attention to stockpiling various resources. The steel mills and other heavy industries had enough ore and coal to last for 6 months. The military factories had never stopped operating since their establishment, so Greece had no shortage of various weapons and equipment, and its ammunition reserves were also substantial. However, as the time came, many shortcomings remained. Last year, in response to natural disasters, Greece had used up most of its food reserves, requiring it to import a large quantity of food from Russia. Reserves of other supplies also needed to be strengthened. Even with the military's arrogance, it was clear that the Greek navy could not break through the British naval blockade. Therefore, should war be declared against the Ottoman Empire, Britain would likely immediately blockade Greece's foreign trade, not only import and export goods, but also domestic production if sufficient raw materials were lacking. The Education Secretary was extremely frustrated. His funding request had been suppressed by the Treasury, which infuriated him. It was just a mere million drachmarks, yet the Ministry of Finance said they had no money. This made him unable to resist barging into the Ministry of Finance and confronting the Minister of Finance. What I want to know now is why the originally scheduled allocation was delayed. Don't tell me the Ministry of Finance can't even come up with a mere million drachmarks. The Education Minister's accusatory tone was clear, but the Finance Minister, having anticipated this, maintained a smile and calmly replied, "Believe it or not, the Ministry of Finance indeed cannot come up with this money right now. Of course, it's not that we don't have the million drachmarks, the key is that this money has already been allocated for new purposes. Even all the revenue projected by the tax department for the next year has been secured." Having said that, the Finance Minister produced a stack of documents and continued, "If you don't believe me, you can take a look at these." The Minister of Education took the document, studied it for a while, and confirmed that every expense was clearly listed. After a long pause, he said helplessly, "The war hasn't even started yet, and the expenses are already so high. There's no way around it. To prepare for the upcoming war, the government has decided to expand the army by another division and is also calling up reserves for training. If this continues, in a few months, we won't even be able to pay our staff's salaries." At the cabinet meeting in February, everyone frowned as they looked at the report submitted by the Ministry of Finance. War truly is a money-devouring beast. Greece is only in the mobilization preparation stage, and its previously ample finances are already heading into a deficit. At this rate, Greece's finances will likely go bankrupt before the war even begins. Prime Minister Sanos broke the silence. "Gentlemen, you have all seen the report presented by the Finance Minister. If we continue to prepare for war according to plan, even with the most optimistic estimate, we will run out of money in 5 months. By then, our finances will collapse before the war even begins. But to complete the war plan, we need a sufficient army. Expanding the army, recruiting and training reserves, and stockpiling various supplies are all essential," General Corinth said, frowning. "But no money is no money. Are we going to raise taxes?" the Chancellor of the Exchequer said. "We could impose a war tax, but according to our calculations, it would only allow us to hold out for a month or two at most." Everyone fell silent. They were faced with only two choices, either find a way to raise money or scale back their war preparations and cut costs. But foreign loans were expensive in this era, and more importantly, they usually came with political conditions, requiring the mortgaging of sovereignty. Greece had just barely managed to pay off its British loan. They might agree to loans from Britain or Russia, but once war breaks out and Greece acts, they'll be utterly antagonizing Britain. At this point, Otto said, "Don't worry about the finances. The government is preparing to issue bonds, with the National Bank and the Royal Bank jointly responsible for the issuance." "Your Majesty," the Chancellor of the Exchequer said, "in the best-case scenario, according to our estimates, the high expenditures will continue for at least a year. That means we need to prepare at least 300 million drachmarks, which our domestic financial markets cannot raise." Issuing bonds was simple, the key was finding buyers. These days, ordinary people had virtually no savings. Even if every Greek loves their country and is willing to contribute their meager savings, they still can't possibly have that much money after experiencing a year of famine. Therefore, they will have to rely more on bourgeois groups. But everyone knows what capitalists are like. Capital is averse to risk, and war is inherently a highly risky endeavor. Especially since Greece has no notable military achievements, it's hard for these people to believe that Greece will ultimately win. At this point, Otto spoke up, "Don't worry, in my opinion, this problem can be solved in stages. Our funding gap isn't that large all at once, so naturally we don't need to issue so many bonds all at once. We can gradually push them to the market in batches, first issuing 150 million drachmas in bonds, with a royal consortium subscribing to 100 million drachmas. The government won't be without revenue in the future. As long as the remaining 50 million drachmas can be raised, it should be enough to meet the funding needs during the war." Everyone fell silent. They knew Otto's royal consortium was wealthy, but they hadn't imagined it to be this rich. In those days, most currencies were pegged to precious metals. 100 million drachmas was roughly £5 million, equivalent to nearly 37 tons of gold. This was more than the gold reserves of many small countries. Even a country like Russia had only a little over 100 tons. Of course, the calculations weren't quite accurate, but the Crystal Palace, which Britain used to amaze the world in 1851, cost only £80,000, giving a glimpse into the sheer scale of this sum. For a moment, everyone felt a surge of breathlessness, as if Otto himself radiated golden light as he sat in his seat. For Otto, coming up with so much money all at once was extremely difficult. In fact, it could be said that he had almost staked his entire fortune on this war. If the war failed, not only the Greek government but also the royal consortium would collapse due to financial problems. The following plan is crucial to the future of Greece. We must go all out. If we fail, I guarantee that none of you here will fare well. So I hope everyone will give it your all. Otto's tone was calm, but everyone couldn't help but feel a chill. They knew that King Otto was not as benevolent and kind as he was portrayed. He had never hesitated to be ruthless when necessary. Otto has made such a huge decision and paid such a high price. If the plan fails due to the mistake of just one person, death would be the most merciful end. Thinking of this, everyone said in unison, "Your Majesty, please rest assured, we will do our utmost to prepare and ensure the plan succeeds without fail." End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.